Oyez, oyez, oyez. Anyone having business before the King's Justice of the Superior Court of Justice, attend now and you shall be heard. The Honorable Madam Justice Hennessy presiding. Long live the King. You may be seated. Unless done in accordance with the Superior Court of Justice protocol on the use of electronic devices, these proceedings are not to be recorded. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, all. Just give me 1 second to set up, please. Whenever you're ready.
Good morning. Our next witness is an economist, David Hutchings. And in discussion with my friends, we've reached agreement on a number of matters to speed up the process. So the first thing that we have, and we've provided copies to the clerk already, which would, I believe, be Exhibit 7, is the expert qualifications of David Hutchings and agreement as to admissibility of his reports. And so it's an agreement as to qualifications and his reports, and that would be Exhibit 7 if the court so pleases.
So, sorry, which one is which? The qualifications are?
The the qualifications in the document entitled Expert Qualifications of David Hutchings and Agreement as to Admissibility of his Report should be reports.
Okay.
And the agreement is that he's qualified as an economist, qualified as an expert in microeconomics, economic and financial data analysis, valuation and taxation, with a specific expertise in the application of economic principles to the valuation of large-scale economic activity and resources, and the estimation of nominal and present values.
Thank you. And that would be marked as?
It should be Exhibit 7 by my count.
Thank you.
That's correct.
And within that, the court might remember that Mr. Hutchings authored a joint report with Professor Stiglitz, and the Stiglitz reports, the joint reports with Professor Stiglitz were marked as Exhibits 4 and 5 already. And there might be some touching upon those reports as well in his direct and cross-examination. But there are a couple of new reports, new documents that have not yet been entered into the record. And they are mentioned at paragraph 2 of Exhibit 7, and the next. Okay. So the next one that I think in proper order would be I call it the Hutchings opening report. It's the expert report for White Sand and Red Rock First Nations dated January 31, 2022.
Yes.
And that would be Exhibit 8.
Thank you.
And then the next exhibit, I believe, which should be Exhibit 9, would be the errata for the expert report prepared for White Sand and Red Rock First Nations of David Hutchings, dated January 31, 2022. And this errata was provided many months ago.
And sorry, Exhibit 9.
It should be Exhibit 9.
Thank you.
And what this errata does is it just, most of it is typo. There's one where there's a substantive change with, I think, but really don't change the flavor of the report, just clear up some quotes and very specific.
In short form, is that errata for Exhibit 8?
Yes, it's errata for Exhibit 8. Yes, thank you. And then the final report would be, to enter right now, would be the expert reply report of David Hutchings dated October 31, 2022, which by my count should be Exhibit number 10.
Got it.
And all of those, I understand, are going in by consent of the parties. Now, before,
Just checking, council, that's all on consent. Thank you. Yes. Go ahead.
before we proceed with some questioning for Mr. Hutchings, Mr. Hutchings has prepared a slide deck similar to what Professor Stiglitz did, and we had some computer problems last night. The printer decided not to print, and we were able to print out one partial copy, and I say partial copy because part of the ink just doesn't show up. So it makes graphs a little bit difficult to read when the graphs don't show the lines. So what we've done is we've arranged for a professional printing company to be producing it. It's in the works right now, should be available by noon. But for now, we're going to have the electronic copy for everybody. The electronic copy has been circulated last night when it was finalized. We will have hard copy and a replacement hard copy for the court.
Well, I see that I have this tab says only copy.
That's correct.
Should someone else have it?
No, I
Do
think
you
you
need it? Do
should.
you witness need it?
I think, I mean, look, if I had it, I might have made some notes on it. I thought the most important person to make notes on it might be the judge. And so if there was going to be anyone that had the opportunity to have it at this stage before lunch,
Okay.
it made sense for the court. And my friends, to be fair to my friends, they haven't had an opportunity to review it thoroughly, to accept that it should be a numbered exhibit. So for now, because we will be referring to it, I would ask that it be entered as the next lettered exhibit for now, which would be exhibit F, I believe.
And do you think this will be transformed into a numbered exhibit?
Yes,
Okay.
I do.
So do you think it's necessary to make it a lettered exhibit?
I do, just in case my friends take objection at some point.
Okay.
Until they agree, it should just be a lettered exhibit, or until there's a ruling made.
All right.
Mr. Hutchings, before we leave this lettered exhibit F, he needs to be sworn in. Yeah.
So we're gonna start first by you stating your first and your last name for the record.
David Hutchings,
Do you mind spelling both your first and your last name?
DavidHutchings.
Thank you. Swear on the holy book.
Sure.
Do you swear that the evidence to be given by you to the court touching the matters in question between the parties shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
So help me God, I do.
All right, Mr. Hutchings, just staying with the exhibit F for identification. That was a slide deck prepared by you.
That's correct.
And it, to the best of your knowledge, it demonstrably explains and fairly represents your reports.
That's correct.
And it also, in your view, fairly represents your replies to the other experts.
That's correct.
And we'll be going through that slide deck electronically this morning, and hopefully we'll have hard copy later today. Before we sort of go any further, I just wanted to confirm with you that the reports exhibits, which are exhibits 4 and 5, that's the joint reports with Professor Stiglitz, and the reports admitted today, exhibits 8, 9, and 10. You consider those to be accurate?
That's correct.
And you made some with the corrections in the errata, of course.
That's correct. And with the work papers that provided along with them, they're all part of the same package.
Right. And well, the work papers are part of exhibit 1, but they're in the record.
Okay.
And those are accurate and they've been updated recently.
Yes.
And together, those packages present your, what is the content of your opinions that you've been asked to opine on?
That's correct.
And I wanted to go through just a very few highlights of your experience. Can you tell us about your education?
Sure. I guess after high school.
Yeah, please.
I received a Bachelor's of Science in Economics with a minor in music and a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I worked for a bit. I then received a Master's in Economics from the University of Toronto. And then I worked, and while working, I received a law degree also from the University of Toronto.
Okay, and I understand that you have worked for I guess, industry and the Internal Revenue Service as well. I mean, can you explain what you've done?
Sure. So my professional employment has been with the Brattle Group throughout, but I've been retained by clients, both government organizations and private parties to do economic research.
And you have some understanding of the mining industry. Can you explain how you came about that understanding and knowledge?
Sure. So I've been retained to do some other work related to mining, and my grandfather was involved in a mining business. And so over the years, I've had some engagement with the family business on mining in Newfoundland.
And in Exhibit 8 at page 1 of 127 at paragraph 2, you say that I have been undertaking economic research projects for clients at Brattle for more than 10 years with a focus on valuation and damage estimates, tax and transfer pricing. I want to stop there.
Sure.
And have you explain what transfer pricing is?
Sure. So transfer pricing basically relates to when two related parties transact. At what price should they transact? I'm using it here mainly to refer to tax transfer pricing. And you can think about this. Say we had a company that had operations in Canada and the United States. They sell the product in Canada for $100. They make it in the United States. All in, the cost is $50. We'd say the profit is also $50, 100 minus 50. And that's fine if you're just an investor in the company. But the taxing authorities care how much of that $50 is in Canada and how much of that $50 is in the United States. Because it's a related party, they get to set the price themselves. And so transfer pricing is trying to answer that question of how should they set that price in a fair way that replicates what we call an arm's length price or a competitive market, or what economists like to think of as well-functioning markets.
Now,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but could I ask Ms. Martineau if she could give me a hand here? I'm not. Apologies. Thank you.
no. Just before we continue, Mr. Hutchins, you actually have a tendency to speak a little fast.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if you might just slow down a bit for the reporter. You were just, I think, on the edge of ability.
Okay.
My
apologies.
Well, again, you don't have to apologize, just, be cognizant of slowing down just a bit. So paragraph number 2, it says, I have valued contingent interests in power facilities. Can you, would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure. So when you think about a facility that makes power, that's a project or an asset that might need to be valued, either for someone to purchase it. This particular set of assignments related to contingent interest, which was where someone had like an option. It wasn't a straight up ownership. And that was in the context of a tax controversy dispute. But as a result, you have to understand how a power facility makes money to be able to value either the facility or an interest in the facility. So
Thank
that's a
you.
little bit what that work relates to.
And it says here that you've assessed prices for stumpage. So you've done some work in forestry?
That's correct. That was in a dispute between a corporation and people providing services to that corporation over how certain prices were calculated.
And amounts paid to loggers, I guess that was part of the same retainer,
Yes,
the same work you did. And it says you've authored white papers on energy markets.
that's right.
And you've opined on cost allocation matters. Now, I understand cost allocation is sort of central to one of the issues the judge has to decide in this case.
Mhm.
Explain what cost allocation is.
Sure. So cost allocation comes up a lot in those transfer pricing disputes I was talking about earlier. But you can imagine, there's a head office, in my very simple example of the Canada and the US company that makes a product and sells a product. There's some head office that oversees both. Those costs have to go somewhere. If you weren't to include them, each of the individual divisions would look more profitable than they are. Those individual divisions may not have an accountant, for example, because it's more efficient to have one accountant at the head office. But if you're going to value either of those individual parts, you need to include some of those overhead costs. And there are different ways to allocate them. It's a very simple example. We'll get into some more complicated ones later, but that's the basic idea of how do you include what sometimes economists or accountants might call indirect costs to make sure you're accurately reflecting typically the profitability or the revenues of a business.
So overhead and indirect costs are the
Yes.
same thing. Thank you.
And as part of your reports, you've signed a document to abide by Rule 4.1 of the Ontario Rules of Civil Procedure. I'm not going to go through it exactly, but the gist of it is that you understand your duty is to do your best for the court.
That's right.
Let's turn to your demonstratives, which is Exhibit F now. I think now would be a good time. You don't have a hard copy, but you do have an electronic copy in front of you, and the court has for now a hard copy. But let's start with the assignment that we asked you to do.
Sure. So I was originally asked in my report last January, which I think is Exhibit 8, a series of questions, one of which I'm going to talk about today, which is what is the present day value of the net Crown resource-based revenues that were collected in the RST from 1850 to 2019. Later, we'll call this the NCRR approach, just to adopt common terminology. I was also asked at that time a couple of other questions about applying a framework that Professor Stiglitz and I had developed in other joint work, but that's kind of been superseded by the joint report. So I'll talk about that on the next slide. And I was also asked, and this is memorialized in my report of October 31st, to review Ontario's and Canada's experts' analysis of the NCRR question as an economist. And so I documented those in my report, October 31st, 2022.
Okay, perhaps we can go to the next slide.
Sure. I was also asked.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I was also asked 3 questions jointly with Professor Stiglitz, the same 3 questions he talked about last week. What is the value of the RST lands, waters, and resources that were extracted or used from 1850 to 2019? What are the economic principles that might be of assistance in determining the sharing between the Crown and First Nations? And then this question on the relative wealth and needs, as I understand it, to be responsive to the Court of Appeal. My testimony and my slides will kind of address the details of the calculations for the first and third items, given some of the principles Professor Stiglitz addressed last week. And then we both jointly authored a reply report. I've forgotten the exhibit number, but to address some of the opinions of Ontario's and Canada's experts on value and risk in particular that Professor Stiglitz spoke about last week.
Yeah, the joint reply report is Exhibit 5 for the record. All right, so now we had reports introduced into evidence and you just wanted to mention them, I understand?
Yes, it's just a summary of all the work. There was the January last year opening report. There were then some of those text errata that were served in June. There was also some updated work papers, but that was all incorporated in my October reply report. And then the joint reports with Professor Stiglitz from last month. And I note here that that opening report with Professor Stiglitz supersedes what was section 5 in my opening report. That was what I mentioned about me doing some work based on earlier joint work, but it's now all been rolled in to our report here. And just the third bullet there is, and why I mentioned work papers earlier. The work papers provided with that report include a new geographic area for calculation of past compensation. I was instructed to use by council for my opening report. So that updates all of the calculations. So here are the summaries of all the calculations I'll be going through over the next little while. You can see there are estimates of net crown resource revenues.
So let me just stop
Sure.
you for a moment. This slide here represents the, in effect, it's an introduction of the final takeaway.
That's right.
This is page 5 of the slide deck. Or slide 5.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
And I just want to stop here for a moment. And I note that on the slides we've been going through at the bottom right-hand corner, there's a reference to where in the record one can actually find what is on the slide.
That's right. Wherever possible. And that's, I think, just about every time I cite something from my report site. So if you go to that paragraph 36, you'll find, I think, the middle row of that table. If you go into the work papers, you'll find the other estimates in the first and third rows.
All right. And so tell us what the bottom line is and how you, and on these numbers.
Sure.
And explain them just a bit, just in an introductory way, because we're going to get into each one quite detailed.
Absolutely. So the first column is labeled nominal. I think Professor Stiglitz talked about this last week. Nominal dollars is what economists mean when we talk about dollars in the currency of the time. So, you know, $1 in 1900 equals $1 in 1950 equals $1 today. Just adding it up without getting into time value of money issues. So taking that first column, and these are in millions of dollars. So it's $1,000 million or $1 billion. That's for the net crown resource revenues. The second entry is this.
Sorry, you said 1 billion. It's 1 billion 44.
Right,
Okay.
1,044 million, and there are lots of other numbers that go further to the right, but rather than print it all out.
Okay, we're just dealing with the nominal now.
So, so does it say on the page anywhere that this is in billions?
So just on the top left, it says dollars millions. Top left corner of the table.
Just on
Yes,
top.
yes,
yeah.
got it.
So I say 1,000 million is.
Ah,
billion.
got it. Thank you.
Of course. The next one is 3.58 billion or $3,500 million. That's rents. Rents net of crown expenses. These are the same figures that Professor Stiglitz spoke about last week. And then we have the income gap calculations as well. Get into those. I think Professor Stiglitz talked about the framework. I'll get into some of the details of the calculations. And that one is about $5.5 billion. Now the next three columns, that's called B&S, long-term bond, BTA, Hutchings, and 60/40 equity to debt approach. Those are three different measures of the present values, all as of March 31st, 2020. So the BNS long-term bond, that's using the approach of Professors Bodway and Smart. Rather than read all, or maybe you want me to read all them.
Well, I guess,
I'll take the first row.
sure.
So that's about $8.9 billion at their preferred rates of interest. The next column is BTA, that's short for banned trust accounts. I describe in my report, and we'll talk about in more detail in the slides. How I can also use the rates that were published in the manual for the administration of band monies. That comes out to about 9.9 billion. Those rates are close to, but in some years higher than the long-term bond rates. That's why it's a little higher.
Now it says Hutchins on it, but the 60-40 equity to debt approach is your preferred approach.
That's correct. The 60-40 equity to debt is what I opine and Professor Stiglitz opines is the most appropriate method. And this is based on a mixed portfolio of equities and debt securities. And that yields a number of 56.9 billion for the first row. That's a higher amount because the rates are a couple of percentage points higher, and over 170 years, a couple of percentage points compounds quite substantially.
So did you just say 9.9?
So 9.9 for the band trust accounts.
Ah.
And 56.9 for the 60-40. The top right entry.
Oh, sorry. I meant interest rates.
Oh.
Were band trust accounts, do I recall the evidence that they average 7.2%?
No, the 7.2% is the 60-40 approach.
Oh,
The band trust accounts averaged 5.3%.
5.3. Sorry. Thank you.
And the long-term bond is just a little bit over 5.
That's correct. Yeah.
Now,
Those are
those
quite
are,
close.
again, nominal rates of return. Those rates, the a little over 5% for long-term bond, about 5.3 for band trust, and about 7.2 for the 60-40 equity debt.
Mhm.
That does not take into account inflation.
Well, you're right. It doesn't. You should apply those rates of return to nominal dollars because inflation's not yet been adjusted. See, those are nominal rates of returns that should be applied to nominal dollars. If you wanted to calculate real rates of return, you'd have to apply those to real dollars, but those are the nominal rates to apply to those quantities in the first column called nominal dollars.
Right. But in terms of the actual spending power, you have to take into account inflation.
That's correct.
So let's go through an outline of what you're going to help us with, or what you're going to help the court with in your testimony.
Sure. So there are three big topics related to the assignments. The first is this net crown resource revenue, or NCRR calculation. And within that, I mean, I boiled it down to three subheadings here. As we'll discover, each of those has a lot more behind it. But the first step is to identify and allocate the relevant direct crown resource revenues.
Okay, I want to stop you there. You've used the word direct.
Yes.
Is there a meaning to that?
Yes, we'll get into this in a little bit, but the direct crown resource revenues are resource revenues that are specific to an industry. I think I refer to them as resource specific levies. So this is your stumpage charges, your mining profits tax, your water rental fees. It's not other revenues the Crown gets from resources like indirect tax revenue, from sales taxes or income taxes, or those sorts of things, even though in many cases, the generation of those revenues is dependent on the resources as well. The second step, B here, is identifying, attributing, and allocating Crown expenses that collect, support, or regulate those revenues, which is the relevant direct Crown resource revenues. And you notice I've inserted another word there, and we'll talk about allocate versus attribute in a little bit. There's an issue of allocating it to the geography, because many times we only have data, say on Ontario as a whole, and we allocate certain things to the RST. Then the attributing.
RST is Robinson Superior Treaty Territory.
That's correct. That's correct. And then the attributing also relates to whether or not that expense or any expense is attributable to a revenue. And we'll talk about this is where some of the cost allocation and overhead we talked about earlier will be relevant. And the third part of my evidence on NCRRs is to reply to mainly Ontario's experts, Professors Beaudoin and Smart, both the evidence in their rebuttal and then what they've added in their SIR reply reports.
Okay.
The second topic is the details of the calculations of economic rent, the framework of which Professor Stiglitz laid out last week. I'm going to get into the the nitty gritty, if you will, of how we go about estimating those for the territory. And then the third topic is estimating the relative wealth and needs of the RST Anishinaabe as compared to settlers or non-Indigenous people.
So we're gonna, it looks like our first topic then is net crown revenues and a summary of your net crown resource revenue analysis.
Yes, so this is putting a little more detail on all the steps to go through when it comes to analyzing NCRRs.
Okay,
So I'm going to start by updating my results based on the area for past compensation provided by council. So
the area for past compensation, that's the geographic area.
the geographic area, that's correct. I was provided with additional detail that was calculated in my work papers. That's reflected on the slide we looked at earlier with all the numbers. But I just want to provide a mapping, if you will, to the other reports, so nobody's confused about why two numbers look very similar but aren't identical.
Okay,
Then I'll talk a little bit about the general methodology and the principles for identifying both the revenues and the expenses. And then we'll spend a bit of time on how to allocate Ontario-wide data to the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory. It's perhaps no surprise that in general, data is not kept specific to the RST. And so a large part of the exercise is how do we take a value, a revenue or an expense that we just know happened in Ontario generally and allocate some portion of that to the RST. And then I'll go through line item by line item. And in particular for expenses, I'm going to talk more about cost allocation. And then I'm going to talk about data availability before and after 1945, because I adopt a different method for expenses after 1945. And lastly, I'll respond to the crowd questions.
So,
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So the first topic to address is updating my results. So as I mentioned, in January 24th of this year, council instructed me as to the correct geographic area to use for purposes of calculating past compensation. And I will update those results here just to show everyone so we have a mapping. And I'll make a note here that throughout this presentation, I'm going to have maps. They depict the RST territory. They're illustrative. They don't all represent this geographic area. But for purposes of explaining my methodology, that's more than sufficient to explain how I can take a boundary and apply it to a set of maps. So the next slide.
can I just ask one question? Should I understand that the updated geographic area represents the agreement ultimately reached amongst the parties?
yes, yes, yes.
How to deal with it? So this is where it's dealt with, or this is where it's updated?
It's updated in the work papers, and the court is not going to actually see that map.
Right, but it's not going to be addressed another time. There's no there will be no new overlay to bring in evidence with respect to that agreement.
That's correct.
Okay,
Yeah. Well, I'm presuming there won't be, and just to give the flavor, what happened is in the material that you're going to see in the slide deck, Mr. Hutchings was originally given what's called the S-curve map.
Mhm.
And subsequent to that, all the parties met and agreed on a particular geographic area for the purposes of sharing past compensation.
Yes.
The result of that was to actually lower the amount calculated as owing to RST by a small amount.
Okay.
And that's why if you actually look at the original reports, it's a little bit higher than the reports that are in the slide deck.
thank you.
So the next slide, I think here's the comparison, Mr. Schechter, you were just talking about. That first row, it'd be my calculation of net crown resource revenues using the S-curve map. So if you look at my reply report, you'll see I said the NCRR amount was 1.063 billion and slightly higher present values using the long-term bond and the 60-40 equity debt approach. This is a table from my reply report. And the updated numbers shown on the line below are what we looked at a few minutes ago in that summary slide. So this is provided just in case someone is wondering. I'm talking about 1.044 here today. Why does the report say 1.063? That difference is the updated geographic area.
And all of that will be found in the work papers.
That's correct.
So the number you'll be working with will be 1.044.
That's correct. Okay. So we start with the general framework for calculating net crown resource revenues. Say net crown resource revenues aren't a phrase or a term you'll find in the glossary of an economics textbook. So I look to the guidance from the court, from the stage one reasons, as to what net crown resource revenues are meant to capture. And we talk about revenues arising directly or in a closely related way to the land and resources, that's the revenue part. And the expenses are expenses related to collecting, regulating, and supporting those revenues. So that's what I'm going to talk about in terms of identifying revenues and expenses.
Now you've made reference to the stage one reasons, but that's also repeated in the Court of Appeal judgment,
That's correct.
or the judgment as amended by the Court of Appeal. Yeah. No change in the wording there.
This wording is the same. That's right.
Okay.
So from this, I kind of take three key elements or three key steps to calculating net crown resource revenues. The first is identifying the relevant revenues. By relevant, I mean those that arise directly or in a closely related way to the land and waters and resources. Step two is to identify expenses related to those revenues. And then finally, attributing and allocating those revenues and expenses to the RST territory. So I have this graphic that I included in my opening report to kind of summarize at a high level this geographic allocation issue. So if we start in the top left, which is the dark blue area, kind of have two inputs, right? We have a map of the territory, but Ontario typically doesn't measure outside of a few select areas I'll talk about later or track data based on the RST territory. It has various administrative districts. These could be townships, these could be lumber districts, these could be mining districts. They change over time, their names change, their boundaries change. It's just how Ontario administers itself. And we have many maps over time of these changing districts. But given I have a map of the territory and a series of maps of the districts, I can kind of put one over the other and express RST as a sum of the pieces of those districts, which we'll talk about in the slides. So I may not know exactly from Ontario's data what's in the RST, but I know certain townships are included, certain are excluded, and some are partially included. And I can do all that using the maps. So that gives me RST, as I said here, as pieces of districts. Okay. Then I also need to think, okay, how are those districts, how Ontario records the data, how are they related to Ontario as a whole? And we have the maps, but we need to also find evidence either on revenues or expenses directly or proxies therefore. And I'll talk about that in a little bit because we don't always have revenue specific data. Some years it might say in a given district, X dollars was collected. Other years it may not. We may have some proxy such as the number of people engaged in logging activity in that district.
You said you don't have revenue specific data. Did you mean?
I meant for the district, I don't always have data on the
Okay.
revenues collected in the district. Sometimes it's some other proxy, such as the number of people working in a given resource in that district. We then make an assumption that that's a reasonable proxy for the activity in that district. But that allows us to then say, how important are each of these districts relative to Ontario as a whole? So if we know how much activity is in Ontario, we can say a certain percent is in each district. So I have RST as a sum of pieces of districts. Then I have districts relative to Ontario as a whole. I can combine those together in, I guess it's the teal box in the middle, which is a way of expressing RST as a share of the province. Share of resource activity. Again, this is done for each resource. And then from that, I can multiply by revenue data from the Ontario Public Accounts, which is this ledger of how much revenue by particular line item was received by Ontario as a whole and estimate the RST Crown resource revenues. That's the circle on the bottom left.
Now, just to be clear, there's little where it says multiply on the on slide 15. There's an X there. That's a multiplication sign. That's not saying there's anything wrong.
Yes, that's right. I'm not saying, stop. I'm saying multiply with the X.
I knew that.
Okay.
Okay. And
I'd not thought about that until this moment, so thank you. And similarly, on the right-hand side, once we identify provincial resource revenue related expenses from the public accounts, we can do a similar exercise. That's a little more complicated because of the data and the cost allocation problems, but in principle, it's the same. And that gives us the red circle at the bottom, just RST Crown resource revenue related expenses. Revenue related part is to reflect the judgment that it's expenses related to those revenues. And then the dash is a minus sign. So we take the green circle minus the red circle, and that equals the net Crown resource-based revenues, or NCRRs.
now this model,
Mhm.
just go back, stay with this model for a moment. This model, are you aware if any of the other experts have commented on it?
Yes, I think as an illustration of the methodology, I believe Professors Bodway and Smart copied this figure into their report as a representation of the general method.
Okay.
I think it appears as is. So just a note on terminology, I've already used it, but I'll try to separate using the term allocation when discussing geography. So that's the kind of issue of, we have Ontario-wide data or data on a district that doesn't map directly to the RST. So I'll talk about how I allocate those to the RST. And I'll use the term attribution when discussing relevance. And so certain Crown expenses are attributable to certain Crown resource revenues. Just so I don't end up using the word allocation twice to mean two different things. And attribution will also involve a stage of whether something is fully attributable or partially attributable. This is related a little bit to our indirect and overhead discussion.
Okay. I think we're ready for that.
I want to start with just an overall comparison with the Crown's experts. I understand there was a desire to know about broad areas of agreement and disagreement. So in terms of areas of agreement in the NCRR calculations at a high level, when we get into the details of resource by resource, I'll comment specifically. But I think at a high level, there's agreement on the data sources in terms of the types of reports, many times the specific reports, the specific tables that are relevant for this calculation, or relevant to consider. We may differ in how we use them, but the set of data, I don't think there's a big disagreement about.
Now, there was a time when the experts were working together to try and do some of this work.
Yes, throughout 2021, we had a number of conversations. I say we, primarily Professors Bodway and Smart and myself, and another expert who won't be testifying. And some broader conversations. I also had a couple of conversations with Mr. Hamal, who's another expert retained by Ontario, both in a group setting and one-on-one. I guess that's built into 2022 as well.
Right. And that discussion was to try and come to agreement where you could, I take it.
Yes, certainly to try to reach agreement on what are the data. As we said, we would like to avoid issues of whether a given number is correct and maybe retain, the disagreements would be limited to the methodological or principal questions of what should you do with that number. But given the 170 years of data and the transcriptions, and we'll see, some of it's handwritten, try to avoid. So when we get to this stage, we're not having arguments over was that number a 5 or a 6. Instead, it's should that 5 or 6 be counted and in what way? And I think we generally did fairly well at that. We exchanged data, we exchanged, related to the second point, geographic allocation, a lot of what we've called proxy data. So in terms of where we could find data on other things related to resource activity. So we'll get into using the census from 1901, the value of log products as a reasonable way to estimate resource activity. And so we shared a lot of those data back and forth. Again, all trying to just answer the question of, really interesting question, theoretically, of how do you take this set of data and bring it to RST. So I say there's general agreement on that. There are a few minor things where we disagree on geographic allocation, and I think they say as much in their reports. And relatedly, we have general agreement, I think, on what I'll call gross Crown direct resource-based revenues, which is the revenues before we get into the expenses. In terms of
And
the
we're going to
amounts.
see that later on, I think, just
Yes,
how
I'll-
close you are on the calculation of what direct resource revenues are.
That's correct. Again, there were a couple of examples, but I think I have 3 slides. What are the big areas of agreement, the big areas of disagreement? And then a couple little areas of disagreement I'll talk about later, but
Okay.
I generally agree here. On net Crown resource revenues from hydroelectricity in particular, Mr. Hamal agrees fully on the revenues, the costs, and the allocation. And again, that's perhaps not surprising. We'd had some conversations in 2021 about where to get data. We talked about how to fill in years where data might have been missing or how to estimate those data reliably. We did not talk about allocation directly, but he then agreed with what I used in my report. I should say, in fairness to Cliff, some issues around the assumptions I might have made, but at the end of the day, concluding it's reasonable and that with imperfect data, it's unlikely to be improved upon. And with a few notable exceptions, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, Professors Beaudoin and Smart and I agree on attribution of most expenses before 1945. I should say they pointed out the same in their SIR reply. There's a small number of meaningful ones. So this leads us into the key areas of disagreement. So a large one is the relevance of certain categories of forestry related expenses. That drives a lot of the differences in our estimates. And by our estimates, I mean mine, as compared to Professors Beaudoin and Smart. And then there's the relevance of 2 categories of transportation expenses: colonization roads and railway subsidies. And then a third kind of broad area of disagreement is the reliability of the public accounts for attributing and allocating expenses after 1945.
And you're all going to get into all these areas.
Absolutely, I'll get into all of those.
Can I just take you back?
Sure.
Could you give me a word for those areas of disagreement? My understanding is, among other things, that it had to do with sets of data, but I'm not sure what it is. That you
Sure.
ended up, you summarized by saying, so we agreed on all of that, but I'm not sure I got it.
Sure. So the disagreements?
No, the agreements.
Oh, the
So,
agreement.
so you have,
Right. So I think by sets of data, what I
oh,
mean.
no, you're right, it was the disagreements.
Oh, the disagreements. Okay.
You said you tried to reach agreement on what is data, so you could restrict disagreements to methodology or principled or principal questions.
That's correct.
And you exchange data and work together to figure out how to bring this data to the RST.
That's correct.
And so your principal areas of disagreement are just what you're now telling us is the categories of forestry expenses, for instance, relevance to transportation expenses.
That's right. And
Okay.
what I mean by relevance is, I don't think we have a dispute over like what the dollar amount is in
Right.
1950. It's what one should do with what that dollar amount is. That's what I mean by questions of principle or methodology.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yes, thanks.
And here are a list of smaller areas of disagreement in the net Crown resource revenue calculation. There are 3 disagreements on revenues. I say in parentheses up top, small impact, because as we'll see later, you don't have a large quantitative impact, but I just want to be thorough and explain that there are some areas we disagree on. The mining profits tax in 1935, the relevance of logging tax from the 50s to the 80s, and the relevance of spectrum. I think Professor Stiglitz spoke a little bit about spectrum last week, but I'll speak about that again in my evidence.
Okay.
And then smaller areas of disagreement on expenses are mining rehabilitation, forest reserves, insect control, and research. I'll talk about those a little bit later as well.
Okay. So now we're going to turn to how you look at or how you identify relevant revenues.
That's right. So Again, I'll just start with the quote about what relevant revenues are. They're resource-based revenues arising directly or in a closely related way to the use, sale, or licensing of land, which could include the waters. Some examples here: stumpage charges, mining profit tax, water rental fees. On those, there's no dispute between myself and the Crans experts that those are relevant revenues. But before getting into the details of how we allocate and identify those revenues, I want to talk about a couple of topics that I think help contextualize how I approach this question. The first is the declining importance over time of what are called, again, direct resource-based revenues. So that's the stumpage charges, the mining profits tax, the resource-specific levies on these companies.
So when you say declining importance to whom or what? Can you just clarify
The
that?
declining importance to Ontario as a whole, if you will, in terms of how Ontario as a whole raises money. And then kind of flowing from that is the inherent conservatism in excluding indirect tax revenues, like those from income taxes, sales taxes, etc. And I also talk about my decision to generally exclude revenues from what I call cost recovery mechanisms. And again, this isn't a topic of dispute, but I want to address that.
Okay.
So this chart is from my opening report. It shows Ontario, the percentage of Ontario provincial-wide revenues in any given year from mining, forestry, land, water rentals. So this is kind of the percent of Ontario-wide revenues that come from direct Crown resource revenues.
I just want to stop you. I see the chart start, or the graph starts at 1913. Is there anything magical about that?
Just where I felt that there was reliable data available to make this point.
Okay. And there's a gap between in the
Yeah, and
30s
the
to the
gaps,
60s.
sorry.
There's a gap between the 30s and the 60s. What's that about?
Yeah, so the gaps are just where I felt the data didn't exist in a reliable way for the comparison. It doesn't mean it went to zero. It just means it's missing.
Okay.
But the general point is, they started about 30%. So 3 out of every $10 that Ontario collected province-wide was coming from these direct resource charges. And then it tapers off quite rapidly. By the end there, it's a very small number, not zero, but a very small number. Kind of 2 things, I think, feeding that. One is the introduction of income taxes, which we didn't have for a long time, which now accounts for a large chunk of Ontario's revenue. And another part is the diversification of the economy.
The diversification, sorry, I didn't hear.
Diversification of the economy.
Okay.
So this is a snapshot in time of the most recent fiscal year included in my data, which is 2018-19 fiscal year. So this is looking at, again, for that year, what are all the pieces that make up the pie of Ontario's revenues? And you can see the big ticket items are personal income tax. It's in the bottom right, I guess the teal one. It's about a quarter of all revenue. Another big ticket item is sales taxes, gas taxes, excise taxes, land transfer taxes. That's the green slice on the left. That's about another quarter. Corporations tax, that's kind of your usual business income tax. That's about 12%. Federal transfers are another chunk. And the federal government finances itself in a similar way, mainly with income taxes. And then we see Crown corporations such as the Lotto Commission and the LCBO, the Liquor Commission, 3.5%. And so the little wedge at the top, kind of right under the word government, you see direct resource related, 0.2%. So this is just calculating the exact number shown on the prior chart, that 0.2% of Ontario's money comes from direct resource related revenues.
Right. So that's in 2019. But if we did a pie back in 1913, that it would be bigger.
Yeah, that slice would be 30%.
So it's 30% compared to 0.2%.
Yes, it's declined. So you may ask the question, well, why did I exclude indirect revenues? Economically, I think Professor Stiglitz was speaking about this as well. Some portion of revenues from income and other general application taxes arise directly or in a closely related way to the use, sale, or licensing of land. If you're not using or selling the land or cutting down trees, that business may not generate profits, it may not pay people, and some portion of those tax revenues are from that activity. But from a practical standpoint, the appropriate share of those taxes is difficult to estimate. Another note, of course, is that these taxes didn't exist before the war. So before the First World War, not the Second World War, it's a little more straightforward. After, it's difficult to parse out. We see that huge chunk of personal income tax revenue. It's just a difficult exercise to say what of that is related to people engaged in resource activities, what portion of that is related to resources versus their other forms of human capital. So as a result, I don't include them just as a practical standpoint. And I'll discuss this more. It has implications for the expense analysis because we're limiting, the relevant revenues to be just those direct ground resource revenues. And that becomes those revenues. And so we need expenses related to those revenues, not other revenues. Cost recovery mechanisms. I mentioned this, I mentioned it in the report. Some Crown revenues are designed less to raise revenue and more to offset the cost of activities. We see this with Ontario Parks as an example. Like sometimes it even shows up in the public accounts net of cost recoveries because it may have cost us a lot of money to run a park, but through the $7 you might pay to go into the park or something, they recover a large chunk of that. And so I don't include those revenues because I don't include those costs. They're not set up to related to the use of the land. They're really providing another service. Fish and wildlife is another example, or fish and game, depending on the year we're in, where you may charge for a fishing license just to offset the cost. The government's not looking to capture some of the value.
Okay.
So the bottom line, you don't
I don't
include the
include
cost recovery as a revenue.
That's correct. Okay. Next slide. This is really just illustrative of the kind of scope of the task ahead of us. So highlighted there in yellow was an illustrative showing of what is RST and what do I show elsewhere. The green area is all the forested area of Ontario, forestry extent of where we have forestry operations. The little blue dots are the hydro facilities, and the orange colored, copper colored dots are the mining facilities. And so basically the task ahead when it comes to revenues is trying to figure out the revenues that accrue to all those blue dots. How do I attribute them to the ones in the RST? Same for mining, and with forestry, how important is the bit that the yellow boundary covers? We'll come back to this map a little later.
But just to be clear, all those dots and all the green outside of the geographic area you considered, they don't go pouring into revenues for RST.
That's correct. Let's talk a little bit about the data sources for revenues. There's really just a couple. So we have this benefit of some detailed records kept from the arbitration proceedings, which is a period of time where there were RST specific data recorded. That's from 1850 to 97 on revenues and expenses. Then generally we have a complete set of data in the Ontario public accounts, or the public accounts of Ontario, which is again this kind of massive ledger of all the revenue items and expense items as the Crown reports it every year by department, an accounting of all the money collected and paid out. So we have those. I use them starting in 1898. They exist before 1898, but and the issue with the Ontario public accounts is it's Ontario wide. So I then have to allocate.
Okay, but just going back to the Irving papers from 1850 to 1897, in your work that you did, now I know the court appreciates this, but the work done in the arbitration proceedings was work done by Ontario and Canada, didn't involve someone on behalf of the Aboriginal people providing their input into it.
That's my understanding. Yeah.
But so just to be clear, did you go back and look at the public accounts between 1850 to 1897 to maybe see if the data set could be more accurately reflect what the revenues and expenses were, or how did you deal with that, if at all?
I did not go back and check. The data before 1897 is sparse, and I would have to engage in an allocation exercise. So I adopt the arbitration proceeding data as is.
And how would you characterize that approach to not going back and dealing with, trying to get better detail between 1850 and 1897.
Sure. Given what you explained, about who was involved in constructing those data, it's likely a conservative approach because one side's views were, as I understand it, were not reflected.
Okay.
Sorry, so continuing the Ontario public accounts, I transcribe data. We'll get into some examples of that, not all of them. I then use other departmental reports. So this is that issue I was discussing earlier, that the revenue data in the public accounts is for all of Ontario. We then need a way of trying to allocate that to the RST or to the districts in the RST, and then allocate those districts to the RST. And so there's many reports, like annual reports of the Bureau of Mines, reports of the Minister of Land and Forest, that have some more geographic granularity. I use those. I will say where more reliable alternatives to the public accounts exist, I use those. And there are some examples of data that were provided, as I understand it, because of this litigation from Ontario, particularly for the more recent years. There was a claims database, some data on mining profit tax revenue. This is data not generally available to the public, but I understand was made available through discovery, sometimes because it might have involved going through tax records and so on. And that's more reliable because it solves in part the geographic allocation issue if someone's gone through the detailed returns of here are the particular companies. So I use those when it's available. So this is just a high level example from 1919. So what are we looking at on the right? That's a map of Ontario. The little gray lines are the boundaries of the Ontario mining divisions as they existed in 1919. So mining divisions is the administrative unit that the Bureau of Mines used at the time for purposes of tracking mining activity. And so what am I showing on the right hand side? I should also explain that pop out isn't some province we've not heard of. It's just a zoom in of Eastern Ontario where the districts are a little smaller. And what I'm looking at here is monies remitted to mining recorders for the fiscal year 1919. That's in the bottom left. So all those dollar signs that appear, in the middle of a territory or in the middle of one of these mining divisions, that's the amount of mining recorder fees in 1919 in that division, as reported by the Bureau of Mines. So then we go to the next slide. We can talk about expressing those as a percentage. So what does this do? Well, this just takes all those dollar values from the prior slide and divides it by the total. So that's a way of saying, I don't know, look at the zoomed in area there, that $12,000 is really 38.7%. So this is the way of measuring what piece of Ontario is in each district. And the next step is how much of those districts are in the RST. So I've zoomed in here now on Port Arthur. This is a district around Thunder Bay. And so we have overlapping or overlaid over the districts, Robinson Superior Treaty. So
For illustrative purposes, not the whole area,
For
but
illustrative
just,
purposes, as I've just zoomed in on this little bit.
yeah.
And so what you can say, looking at it, so of Port Arthur, most of that is orange. Right? So most of Port Arthur is in the RST. Now, I'm just saying that looking at it, it's 60% and 40% is not. And this isn't done by looking at it. This is done with computer programs that actually calculate the percentages. But this is the general approach. And so we do this for each district. And so we can then combine the two. And if I know 60% of Port Arthur is an RST, and I know what percent of Port Arthur is of Ontario, Port Arthur is about 6 and a bit percent, based on that prior data, then I can calculate how much of the total revenue is Port Arthur and RST and start adding that up. So I show that on the next slide.
Just before you leave this slide, just a point of clarification. You talk about computers doing the work. You actually, in sort of doing the geographic area, you had some sort of geospatial coordinates for the for the geographic area,
That's correct.
and then the computer just crunches the math and calculates the area.
Right, that's correct. I was mainly suggesting this one is 60-40, but that's not based on eyeballing it. That's based on the actual calculations. So again, here's my example. 6.2% of the Ontario-wide fees are in Point Arthur. 60% of Port Arthur is in the RST. That means 3.7% of Ontario is in the RST from Point Arthur. And so I would allocate $1,298 of recorder fees as recorded in the public accounts to RST because of Port Arthur. So, what does that say? Well, that's the two maps. I've not showed you the $35,000, but that's the line item for the public accounts in that year.
Just before you leave this, the sort of like yellowy, gray, yellowish stuff behind the blue box that says OPA recorder fees. That's the actual, an excerpt from the
Yeah, that's a
public accounts.
picture of the public accounts, and the line right above the blue box, it's very hard to read, says recording fees, $35,087.10. So that's where we
Okay.
get the information of Ontario-wide, that amount of money was collected.
Okay, and just to be clear, we're in the section of revenues right now.
Yes,
And recorder fees are money coming into the government.
that's correct. That's an example. I mean, that exercise has to be done for every district in every year.
For every revenue source.
That's correct. So now let's talk about the 5 specific revenues I considered: mining, forestry, hydroelectricity, land sales and leases, and spectrum. I'll go through each in a bit more detail.
Okay,
So starting with mining, there are 10 different revenue items that I consider over time. The example we just looked at was mining recorder fees, but the labels the Crown puts on certain fees, when certain fees are charged, how they are calculated, that's not the same every year from 1850 to 2019. And so, in some years there's many line items, and some years there's 1 or 2 line items, but this is the general set. And I'm only talking about revenues after 1898 because we have the papers and the arbitrations that have a direct line item. So I'm not going to go through that in detail. So these are the revenue items. And then each of these can be allocated to RST based on different divisions or different administrative units. It's not as simple that there's only one way to slice and dice the province of Ontario. As we show in the next slide, there are
just before, let's stick with this slide for a moment. There's I guess an asterisk for sale of mining land 1898 to 2019. The asterisk says sale of mining land revenues do not appear from 1964 to 1971 and 1981 to 1992.
That's
And so my question is, what did you do to fill in those gaps?
I didn't do anything. If there's no dollar value, I didn't include it.
So where the data was non-existent, you just didn't include it.
For these years, yeah, that's
Okay.
okay. So as I say, there are kind of a few different ways we need to look at the geography. At different times, we've had districts, mining divisions, municipalities, townships. And then for some of the data, as we'll get into, actually we have mine-specific data. So we have to go find out where those specific mines are. Geographic regions listed on the left are the different ways to cut up Ontario. The revenue items are how I tie those together. And you see on the right-hand side, there's some maps that we get from Ontario GeoHub as a helpful online portal. You get some from the University of Toronto Library. This data source, second from the bottom, the mineral deposit inventory. We'll talk about that. That's a fairly comprehensive data set of former and active mines in Ontario. And mines, they don't move. So once you know where one is, it kind of stays put. So you can get a latitude and longitude coordinate and know where it is, and it's always in or it's always out, which is convenient. The districts and townships, the boundaries move from time to time. One becomes 2, they get renamed, so you have to constantly be updating the map. The advantage with the mines themselves is once you know where they are, you're in or they're out.
Can I just go back to one thing? Where the data was non-existent, you said you didn't use anything. Would I be correct in saying that you allocated 0?
That's correct. For these years, there's one exception, which is mining profits tax in 1935.
Okay.
That I'll talk about a little later. There's a point of disagreement between myself and Ontario's experts.
Okay, thank you.
That's correct. Okay. This is just a summary of the different names of the reports. Sometimes the names change, but different reports that were used in coming up with those district allocations. Maybe best to get into an example. So this is an example here of the report of the Department of Mines.
So you're looking at slide 38.
Slide 38, that's right. So, the first thing we're kind of looking at for allocating the sale of mining land or leases of mining land. So let me back up. We see in the public accounts a revenue item for sales of mining land or leases of mining land. That was the slide we were just talking about. There was that asterisk that in the later years, some years it's missing.
Yeah.
So our problem is, how do we allocate that Ontario-wide amount to the RST? And we can use this table from the report of the Department of Mines. This one's that's screenshotted here at the bottom.
Bottom left-hand side.
Bottom left-hand side, right? That's a picture of the report from 1906, I believe. So it records by district. You see the districts there on the left: Rainy River, Thunder Bay, Algoma, Nipissing, and elsewhere. So they only track for the amount of sales recorded and the amount of leases recorded. That's the boxes I've highlighted in red. So you can transcribe that data and go through an exercise similar to what we went through before with Prince Arthur. So this is just one example of how we did it in the early years. Go to the next slide. How do we actually do this? Well, on the bottom left is a snapshot of the work papers, my report. And you can see what we basically do is we transcribe all those amounts into Excel, and that's how we do the work. So on the right, again, we have this sales and leases from 1903.
So on slide 39 on the right, that's part of the public accounts,
Sorry, no, on the right is the report of the Department of Crown Lands reports.
okay,
This is the geographic stuff. So
okay,
they say there's $14,528.63 from sales of land. So that's the green number. And we include that down below. You see, so what do I mean? From the screenshot on the right, you see that big green box, that number 14,529.
green or teal or
Teal. That's then included in the bottom left in the work papers. That's for sales of mining land. Again, back to the right, the gold box is leases of mining land, $48,000, and that's recorded. So, we go through this exercise every year, and in the work papers, you can see the year, the page where you can find this table if you want to go look it up.
so you did that for each year,
That's correct.
and then you so those numbers go into your database.
Yes.
And then you're going to tell us the next step you did, which looks daunting.
This is just where we find data in the Ontario public accounts. There are different tables or statements, they change over time, and how they're recorded in each year. So if you wanted to go and look up any of the revenue numbers, this would be the table you're looking for in a given year, because you can just see in the first 8 years, it's called balance sheet showing the receipts and payments. The next year, it's called Statement of Revenue from Land, Forests, and Mines. The next year, it's Department of Land, Forests, and Mines. So this isn't too exciting, but it just summarizes, if you wanted to go, these are the different titles in the different years.
Okay.
So I mentioned we have this claims database that was provided by Ontario for the more recent years, 1993 to 2019. This is provided by Township, and it has information on patents, mining licenses of occupation, these sorts of things by year. So just taking a screenshot, the first town is Aberdeen. And then on the right, we have this data from the ministry on the townships. And we basically have to say, for each of those little blue boxes, is it in or out? So taking Aberdeen as an example, just because it's first alphabetically, we see where that's located. It's outside of the geographic area that I'm looking at, so it's not relevant. But again, you just do that same exercise for each township.
You had to do that for all the townships.
That's correct.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Well, the computers help. And then the last kind of data source, and this was provided for only the most recent, I think 13 years of analysis, is this mining profits tax aggregate summary. So data, Ontario provided data on the mining profits tax in each of RHT and RST based on their confidential tax records. So I just get the totals, and I think I get an anonymized version of like company A, company B, but I don't get the detailed breakdown because they're tax records. And so they describe how they undertook the exercise in a written document. They being Ontario, not Ontario's experts, but guessing it came through Ontario's council. I don't need to. Okay.
So,
Someone in the department, I guess, worked on this, provided it to council, and it made its way to me.
so could you just explain what these numbers on slide 42 are telling us?
Sure. So what it's telling us is that the particular profit tax paying mines in RST in the 2006-7 fiscal year, so that's from April 1st of 06 to March 31st of 07, paid a negative 4.6 million in mining profits tax.
Now, last time I, as a taxpayer, had to pay my tax, I didn't get paid by the government when you pay tax. How does that work? That it's
This
a
would be
negative
this would
amount?
Be a refund or lost tax. So, and this year it's negative. In other years, like in the 07-08 year, it's positive 2.9 million.
And so when you, so you took into account negative amounts.
That's correct. I did. Yeah, I mean, if there's a refund or something, then that should be deducted.
Okay.
In my opinion. So let's choose an example of mining profits tax, and I'll show you why. Is that and I talked about all those line items before. The big one is mining profits tax, as you can see from the pie chart. It's basically it's the lion's share of the revenue from 1898 to 2019.
And this represents a long period of time, and
Yes.
that's what your data shows.
That's correct. So how do we allocate mining profits tax? Well, we look at, in the early years, we have data. We can go to the next slide. I think it's the table. that shows
Sorry, it's the lion's share of what?
Ontario mining revenue.
Thank you.
Let me clarify. Ontario Crown mining revenue. So the revenues paid to Ontario, the government of Ontario from mining companies.
The direct.
That's correct. The direct revenues that doesn't include general income taxes. So
And so you're going to take us through an example of
Yeah.
what needed to be done in order to allocate the mining profits tax.
that's right. So this is a statement number 14 from the Ontario Public Accounts of 1947. So that's the
So you're
yellow
looking at slide 45.
slide 45. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the yellow document on the right is a snapshot of the public accounts for 1947. So what we see, right, is taxes, profit tax, $900,000. What that tells us is that Ontario collected throughout the whole province $900,000 in mining profits tax. Doesn't tell us how to allocate it. If we go instead to the annual report of the Department of Mines, which is this document we're looking at now,
Slide 46.
slide 46. This snapshot is from a page 53 of that document. So this is kind of a companion document the ministries themselves put out. It's not the Ontario-wide audited numbers, and what's reported in these annual reports varies year to year. But in 1947, they report details of profit tax by mine. So this is every mine in Ontario that paid profit tax by the type of mineral: gold, nickel, copper, iron, and silver, cobalt, and how much profit tax they pay.
So just let me stop for a moment. They only pay, when do they need to have an income to pay the tax, or how does the mining profit tax work?
Yes, the profits tax is as the name suggests, a surtax on profits from companies engaged in mining operations. It changes over time about the rate, but it's an extra percentage of their profits. So if you weren't earning money, you wouldn't be paying profits.
Sorry, go ahead.
Let me rephrase. If you weren't earning money, you wouldn't have profits. You wouldn't pay profits tax. Sorry, just a step in the middle.
Okay.
Sorry, we can just go back for a second. Two things to note. One, we have every mine here. And the second to note is that the total from the department report is $905,000, which is slightly different than the $900,000 from the Ontario Public Accounts.
How do you account for that?
There can be slight differences in the reporting, the timeline, maybe cash. But the main thing is that the Ontario Public Accounts exist in a consistent way over time, consistent reporting. So I use the 900,000 from the Ontario Public Accounts, but I allocate it based on the proportions of all those individual mines divided by 905,000. This year, it's a small difference. Other years, it can be a little larger, and it can go up or down. But we use the internally consistent data, but we only ever allocate the numbers from the public accounts, which are on a consistent basis.
When you say the public accounts are on a consistent basis, does that change, that consistency change over time?
Not to my knowledge. No.
How it's reported, does it change?
How it's reported does change, but not for mining profits tax, to take a specific example.
Okay,
There's
so
always
we're
a
sticking
line
with
item.
mining profit tax. Okay.
So if we go to the next slide, we can see, again, I'll take the first one in the list. It's alphabetical, honor gold mines. We can then look up from that mining, a mineral deposit inventory database. That's a screenshot on the bottom. This is, publicly available database from Ontario. So past producing mine without reserves, the honor mine, and it gives you the latitude and longitude. So with that information, we can say, where's the honor mine? And go to the next slide, we can see that it's northeast of the RST. It's up toward Timmins. And so that's not relevant. So its share of mining profits tax is not attributable to RST.
But the fact that the share of mining profits tax that honor mine pays is somehow relevant for calculating your data?
Yeah, we just need to be comprehensive given we're based on shares, but rather than go through each mine in the list, on the next slide, I have the two mines that were in RST at this time.
Okay,
So we have Leach Gold Mines and Algoma Ore Properties. They're both in RST. Together, they account for about 0.7% of the total amount on the right. So you see, I would put the little red boxes around them. Algoma Ore, according to the Department of Mines, paid $5,900, and Leach Gold Mines paid $225. So that adds up to about $6,127. That amount divided by the $905,000 in the bottom right is about 0.7%. So we take that 0.7%, we multiply it by the number from the bottom left, which is the 900,000 in profits tax, and we get a result of $6,000.
And 900 was the total profits tax for the property.
Total profits tax by the province, exactly. So in that year, $6,094 of that amount is assigned to the RST.
okay.
I do want to cover, there are some periods of time. Now, I've given you a few snapshots. That one, the mining recorders taxes, the sale and lease of mining's lands, we have very detailed data by districts. Given the changing nature of how government reports these things, we don't always have all the data I would like to have. But it's a few small exceptions. So we do have to interpolate, and interpolate is a fancy word for saying if you have data in one time period and data in a later time period, you're missing in the middle, there are ways to estimate what that looks like in the middle. It's called interpolate because you have stuff on both sides. It's kind of a within sample estimate would be another jargon way of saying it. And this is fairly standard. Sometimes you take a straight line, sometimes you smooth. By smooth,
And interpolate doesn't mean one method or another. It is the exercise
exactly,
of finding a way to get from
exactly,
1903 to 1908 if you have nothing in the middle.
exactly.
Okay.
You could, interpolate linearly, like drawing a straight line. You could take a blended average on each side and say, we're going to say, well, the 3 years before and the 3 years after looked like this. How do we draw it? And for mining profits tax, I actually use another data source to interpolate, as do Professors Budway and Smart.
Where you had to interpolate, can you comment upon the reliability of your interpolation? Without, you don't have to say, get into detail about how you did for each resource, but I take it you put some thought into it.
Yes. So, sometimes, if we're missing 1 year between 2 years, it seems pretty straightforward to just connect the dot. In longer periods of time, so let's take mining profits tax as an example. From 1954 to 2006, we don't have that specific inventory of each profit tax paying mine. But what we do have is information on total mining output in RST and RHT. And there was some overlap in the data from 50 to 53 in 2007 to 2010, where we observed both. And you can look in those 2 periods of time and say, there's a relationship. And by relationship, I mean some kind of ratio between profit tax specific to RST and output specific to RST. And there's a relationship here. And then because we have another data series in between, we can then track those. So, we We have both on the both ends. In the middle, we just have value, and we can use that relationship to interpolate.
Okay.
This is just to be comprehensive, a summary of the different times I was missing data. There's not that many. I just wanted to speak to the mining profits tax one because it's an example of, not using the existing data, but using another data series to say, how can we be sure what's reasonable?
Okay,
So-
and could you comment on the reliability of your interpolation?
I think, looking at a couple of different things, there's a limited number of ways to do this. It seemed consistent. You look at the end to see if you have a smooth curve or if things are really jumping around. If things are really jumping around, you might question your method. Like if you have some step function. We don't have that. And it's similar also to what Professors Bodwin and Smart have done.
Okay.
We can skip over these two slides. Okay, so yeah, to compare on mining revenues from 1898 to 2019, the first row is Professors Bodway and Smart's gross revenues. Should also clarify, this table is also in millions of dollars. So it's not $4,000 that Ontario collected, it's $4 billion. I estimated at 4.2 billion. There's a small difference there. And then when it comes to allocating to RST, I have a slightly lower number, 232 million versus 247 million, relatively small. I should note for completeness, I believe we use different geographic areas, so I can't comment on how that 247 will change.
Yeah, and I believe that Ontario will be at some point in this trial providing updated figures of the geographic area that parties have agreed to use. It hasn't happened yet. But I expect that, like Mr. Hutchings, their numbers will change only slightly. Now, I wonder if now might be a good time to take a morning break. We've been going for a little bit over an hour and a half. I would ask the court how the court feels about taking a little break.
Let's look at how you see the day going for breaks and lunch. What's your,
Well,
looking at your own plan? for
yeah,
your-
looking at my own plan, it looks like we have a lot to cover. So, my plan would be to take a shorter breaks where appropriate, but still to give the court and people opportunities for lunch and for fair breaks. And
So
I do believe
what-
we're
so-
still going to go till 5
Okay,
if
so
we can.
this is the mid-morning break, a lunch break and a mid-afternoon break,
Yeah,
and try to keep the midday breaks or the mid-half-day breaks at 15 minutes.
yes, that
that
would
your
be
plan?
fine
Okay.
if that works.
Sure, let's try that, everyone, and please let me know if there are any problems with that for you, but I know that by starting early and ending late, we're all trying to get this done. Okay, so I have on my thing, it says 10:38. Can we call that 10:40 and 10:40, and we'll be back in 15 minutes?
Yes.
Thank you all.
This court will recess until 10:55. Thank you. This court is now resumed. You may be seated.
Justice Hennessy, in terms of breaks, I thought maybe we could see about going from now till about 12:45
Mhm.
and then breaking till 2 or 2:15 as the court feels. And then if we went from 2:15 to 3:45, had another break and then proceeded on from after a 15-minute break from 4 to 5,
Okay.
if that works for the
I'm just
court.
going to, the most important person here is the reporter. And so we have to make sure that there are sufficient breaks for her to be able to managed. How does that sound?
Thank you, Your Honor, that's great.
Okay.
And I too, I mean, at any time, if you want to break, just, you know, we can break at any time that suits you.
Thank you, Council. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So what, Mr. Hutchins, we're going to turn to, oh, right. The new demonstratives arrived. And so, and it's the same one as the court had, but now hopefully the graphs will be showing up, the colors all show up. And so they will be consistent with what you will see on the images on the computer screen. And so the one that was, if it was technically marked as Exhibit F, we should just replace it as Exhibit F, if everyone's okay with that.
All right. Is there a difference between these two things which I lift
There
before
is,
you?
the only difference is how the colors show up.
Okay. And I'm just going to ask the witness, sir, each time you look at a different screen, could you make sure to let us all know what screen you're at?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll then refer to the one that has just come in.
Yes, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so Mr. Hutchins, we're going to turn to net crown resource revenues and forestry, which is over, I think, at slides 55 now.
Thank you. Yeah, so sticking with the revenues, we're now going to turn to revenues from forestry and go through a similar exercise as I just went through with mining. So this slide shows the 7 different categories of forestry revenue. Again, it's not like the public accounts had one line item that stayed the same for the whole 170 years. Different things have come and gone. And so these are the categories I'm going to talk about and the years in which they are measured, just for reference. The next slide.
Just before you leave slide 55, the last line item is mentioned as logging tax.
Yes,
And is there a disagreement between you and the other experts about logging tax?
there is a disagreement about the relevance of logging tax. I'll return to that in a little bit when I go through our disagreements. It is not a quantitatively significant disagreement relative to the 3 key ones I mentioned at the top.
Okay. So the next slide, slide 56.
Sure. So this just, again, summarizes what are the different administrative units Ontario has used over time for purposes of divvying up Ontario that I use in this analysis. So there's census divisions, there's forest districts, and again, we will look at some snapshots of how those add up. And then in later years, forest management units. And we have some data specific to forest management units that I got through purposes or for purposes of this litigation or through this litigation that help in that later analysis.
All right. And then like mining, we turn to timelines. at
Yes.
Slide 57.
So from 1850 to 97, this is the same data we talked about before, the summary table that had been prepared for the arbitrations that identify particular forestry revenues for RST, and I adopt those. The others, besides the Ontario public accounts, which are the 4th one down, that provide by year the province-wide revenues. The others are how we help allocate those. So you'll see we talk about the Census of Canada that provides information by census district on production, and we use that to help allocate revenues as a proxy, if you will, for how much activity was in a given district. The Department of Lands and Forest report provide for about 30 years in the middle, or 24 years in the middle, I should say, detail by district, by revenue category. So we use those. In the 30s, we used data from the Department of Lands and Forests on operating permits. And then in the most recent 23 years, we use this data set called TREES for Timber Resource Evaluation System. And the RE is capitalized, so the acronym works, but that's just data maintained by the department.
Right.
Okay, so just as an example, for 1901 and 1911, I
You're
allocate.
looking at slide 58.
Yes, sorry about
Okay.
that.
no problem.
First time, and I missed the instruction. I will do better. On slide 58, we're looking at a snapshot from the Census of Canada. We used this in 1901 and 1911. They report by district. You see that's that second column there, Bothwell, Brockville, very comprehensive. And they provide data on the value of logs for lumber and total value of forest products. I've circled those in red. So again, we can use this as an indication for how much of the activity in Ontario as a whole are in the districts that make up our ST, and go through that similar exercise as we went through with mining for Port Arthur. Rather than go through all the maps, I'll just say we did the same thing. So over on the next slide, slide 59, there's another table. This is a snapshot for the period ending March 31st, 1949. I mentioned that before, but a lot of times we talk about years and their government fiscal years, which in the most recent time has ended on March 31st. So most of this data is actually from calendar year 1948, but I'll just clarify that because sometimes we talk about years, but they're not calendar years.
Okay.
So this is representative of what the data look like for this period 1947 to 1966. And what you can see in the leftmost column labeled district, we have the different districts throughout Ontario, how Ontario's divided itself up, if you will, for purposes of administering lands and forests. And we can see there Port Arthur, maybe 60% of the way down the page. That would be one relevant for our exercise. The others are partially relevant, partially not. We go through that same map of where they all are. And what we have here are the different categories of revenue, kind of like the mining recorder fees. So I don't have to guess relatively how much was in Port Arthur. The data is right here of Crown dues collected in that year, and the bottom about 6.9 million, very fuzzy. And so from that, I can say relatively how important are each of these districts and how much of each of those districts is in Ontario, is in RST, which is the same exercise we went through with mining.
So I just want to stay with this for a moment.
Uh-huh.
So for Port Arthur, looks like is that 1,721
No.
million?
It's 1,721,000. This is the
Oh.
40s.
Okay. So that 1,721,523 happened in the Port Arthur district.
That's correct.
And then you've got the total at the 6.899 million you were talking about is the total for all of them.
That's right.
And I noticed there's a part mentioned unallocated.
Yes.
Did you?
I don't try to allocate that, but in most years, it doesn't affect the revenue items I'm interested in. That's what that horizontal line means, is there was no Crown dues unallocated.
Right, but there is under mill licenses and sundry.
That's correct.
And did you take that into account and add that to the revenues?
No. Okay. But it's important, sorry if we just go back. It's important to remember, these are the department reports. So I don't just take that number from Port Arthur. I say, based on this department report, how important was Port Arthur relative to the total? Take that percentage and multiply it by the public accounts, because there's not always perfect correspondence. Just as a reminder.
Yes.
Okay. So this is slide 60, and this is looking at data provided in the Department of Lands and Forests on wood operating permits. So this table at the top, the yellow picture, that's a snapshot of the 1931 report. It's a table on operating permits by inspectorate, basically the same as district. And you see they have mining operations permits, wood operations permits, and other operations. And so what we look at is this column circled in red that talks about the number of people engaged in woods operations by district, and use that as a estimate, relatively how many people were engaged in one district versus another as a proxy for how much activity was there. I should say this is something that was discussed with Professors Bodway and Smart, and I think Professor Smart actually was the one who identified this table, just to give credit.
And did they adopt that approach as well?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Here's our last picture. We're back to the map of districts. So you might say
On slide 61.
slide 61. Yeah. You'll notice there's no Port Arthur on this slide. And that's because we're looking at a different administrative subdivision. This is when we're getting into the forest management units. And so it just highlights that even between the departments at the same time period, they may not use the same administrative subdivisions. So these are all the different forest management units. Based on that data I discussed with the acronym, we have revenue data for each of these districts, but we have to allocate those districts to RST. The orange area is the illustrative RST area. And so you can see, like, take Pick Forest, for example, most of that is in RST.
So Pick Forest is sort of like almost the middle of the map.
So yeah,
Okay.
most of that is in, and a small portion is not. And this is how we would estimate it. By we, I mean the computer program would tell us exactly how much of Pick Forest is colored orange on this map, if I can reduce it down.
So just so that I understand, on top of Pick Forest is, and I want to use Kenogami Forest, there's looks to be very little orange within that whole forest area.
That's correct.
So you would capture or try and capture of essentially the portion of revenues from Kenogami Forest that are represented by the orange overlap area.
That's correct. So for Konogami, we would have a smaller percentage included because if you look at the shape, not sure how to describe that shape, there's only that little bit at the bottom that's orange and a little bit up the side. So now just to provide data on, where do we get the revenue data from the public accounts? This is a snapshot from 1956. I'm on slide 62. So this is the statement for the Department of Lands and Forests. And you see at the bottom there, they have timber management branch. I put that in the red box. Timber dues, bonus, etc. $12,706,730.30. So that's the number, the 12,700,000, etc. that I then allocate using the methods on the previous slides. I will highlight, there's another revenue number there, Mississauga salvage, which is the salvage of fire damaged timber. There was a fire in the Mississauga forest in Chapleau that's not in the RST. And so I don't include that revenue because it's not in the RST.
Right.
Um,
So that brings us, I guess, to periods of interpolation for forestry.
Yes, it's a very similar exercise to what I had to go through for mining. The data are good, they're not always complete. There are some periods, particularly from the 60s to the 90s, where we have that kind of very detailed data in the 60s, the very detailed data in the 90s. I interpolate with effectively a straight line based on the averages on each side. So as you see there, I take the average for the 10 years before and the 10 years after, and then connect them. And overall, there wasn't that much of a shift in those two time periods, as one example. There are others that I discussed there.
And so how would you characterize the reliability of your interpolation for forestry?
I think it's generally reliable. There aren't big swings, and we can track this with other data reported. There are some movements as more forestry shifts to RST from elsewhere. I think we took a very careful look at all the data available, and where we could use reliable data, even reliable proxies like the value of log products or the number of people working in the woods. We use those where we could.
And are you able to comment whether any of the other experts used a similar or a different method, or are you able to comment?
Yeah, Professors Bodway and Smart use a similar method, but in the 70s and 80s, they also use some data from the Statistics Canada census.
Sorry, in the 60s and 70s?
The 70s and 80s, I
70s and
believe. I
80s.
don't have their report in front of me, so I don't want to mischaracterize, but there
Okay.
was some employment data they used in that period of time that I didn't use.
And that brings us, I think, to slide 65, and the work that you did as compared to Bodway and Smart, where do you end up?
Yes, so Ontario-wide, we end up fairly close to each other, $145 million difference. Allocated to the RST, we end up, again, fairly close, $49 million difference, or 9%. I should note again, that 9% number may change a little bit based on their mapping. I'm not sure how that will work out, because we're slightly comparing apples to oranges here.
When you say slightly comparing apples to oranges, that's just because you use the updated geographic area and they haven't used the updated area yet.
That's right. I'm just trying to be, explain why we would expect if those two numbers matched, that wouldn't make a lot of sense because we use slightly different maps.
Okay.
But let me say further, based on how much my numbers changed from the updated area, it wasn't very much. So given we use such similar methods for allocating revenues in particular, I would imagine theirs wouldn't change by very much either.
All right, so now we get to, again, sticking with revenue still, we get to land sales
Yes.
on
So
slide 67.
yeah. Guess I should follow along. So land sales, there are basically I was gonna say there's basically one type of revenue, you sell land. The Crown also leases land, and in the papers from the arbitration proceedings, they just call it collections from sale of land, but the Crown can sell or lease land. We have data up until 1966. After that, some of the data aren't recorded as detailed as we would like. I should also note when it comes to revenues from Crown leases in the bottom, there's this note there that Crown leases included in the early years both leases of land and leases of water for purposes of hydroelectricity, water rental fees. So when I'm talking about revenues from Crown leases here, I've subtracted out the agreed upon hydroelectric revenues, so there's no double counting.
And how did you go about doing that?
I had the data on hydroelectric revenues from a separate source from the department. I had the total showing up in the public accounts, and so I subtracted the two. It's just for that whole pot of revenue, how are you going to allocate it? Are you going to allocate it like it's land or like it's water? And where I can, I split that pot in two and allocate one part based on land and one part based on water.
And what happened after 1966?
Some of the details not available in the public accounts and the report of the Department of Lands and Forests to know where the land was being sold. So I chose not to include it.
So after 1966, if there had been any land sold or leased in RST, what did you do with the revenue from that?
I do not include it in my estimates. For consistency, we're on slide 68 now.
Sorry, and that's an unavailability of data issue.
Yes. So on slide 68 now, we take many times the data is available by township. I'm just noting where we got the maps of the townships over time because townships change, the boundaries change, the names change. We need to keep up to date on that. And then we also have the land districts that we looked at a couple of minutes ago for forestry. That was the Department of Lands and Forests. So we use the same administrative districts. So the land allocation, or the land revenue allocation is really two things we need to do. First, we need to allocate how much of the land was sold or leased in RST relative to Ontario as a whole. And this is typically done on the basis of acreage, because a lot of those reports report how many acres were sold or leased. So we can say what percent of acres was in RST. And then I adjust for likely prices in RST relative to Ontario, because if you allocate just on the basis of acres, you're effectively assuming that all land has the same price. And we know that's not true. So I make an adjustment, I call it the treaty territory deflator, to account for the fact that the price per acre in RST was generally lower than the average price per acre across all of Ontario. And the particular way I do that, and I'll talk about it in the subsequent slides, is using an estimate of so-called unimproved land prices. What does that mean? Well, unimproved land is land without improvements like buildings, but also without improvements like it having been cleared, say for purposes of farming. A lot of times, Statistics Canada or other government statistical agencies report farmland prices as kind of a proxy for land without buildings on it. But you still need to adjust for the fact that particularly in RST and particularly this time, some of the land wasn't even cleared. And so, if you're sitting there thinking about buying or leasing a piece of land, you're going to pay less if you then have to go about clearing it.
And this idea of a treaty territory deflator was that used by other experts as well?
Yes, I don't believe they call it as such, but in their appendix C, Professors Bodway and Smart use the same allocation rules for revenue that I do. So, okay, as I noted, this wasn't noted as either a big or small area of disagreement because it's not a big or small area of disagreement. So here's the treaty territory deflators. As you can see, it floats between about 0.22 and 0.52. What does that mean? That the price of unimproved land is between 20% and 50% as much in RST as compared to Ontario as a whole. Talk a little bit about how I calculate this, but it's a little detailed, so I'll try not to bore everyone.
Well, maybe you can just give the court like a flavor of the steps you took to ensure that there's confidence in these deflator numbers.
Yeah, sure.
If
So
you
when we
could.
flip over to the next page, this is an excerpt for 1905. You have farm values average per acre occupied. That's in the land there. Oh, sorry,
So slide 71.
slide 71.
Thank you.
Tally sheet. So we have Pike County and district, the average value of the land in that first column. And you can see there's a lot of variability. And then in the rightmost columns, we have the rent per acre that's either occupied or cleared. And you see systematically cleared is higher than occupied. That's because cleared land has been improved somewhat. And so I want to adjust for that ratio. So I look at the counties and districts that are in RST, similar sort of exercise we can happen. Figure out the ratio of occupied and cleared, and then compare that to data on Ontario as a whole. And so just try to give you a flavor of where this comes from. And I think the next slide highlights that the Ontario improved price.
So we're looking at slide 72.
Exactly. That's the one at the bottom, but that's an improved price. So we come up with a way to adjust for the treaty territory. And an advantage of this is starting in about 1921, there's a consistent data series from Statistics Canada. So we only have to make a few adjustments, and then we have a deflator that we can apply to a consistent data series from Statistics Canada. It's Ontario wide, but I just have to apply my deflators to that data series.
Okay, thank you.
Here's just some pictures.
At tab 7, at slide 73.
Yeah.
What do these pictures tell us?
So they're pictures of townships. So they're colored in green, the boundaries, and the yellow shape, not really a circle, is the RST. And so we have a lot of data on acres sold or leased by township. And so we figure out what townships are in RST and then allocate based on that. And so you'll notice, particularly in the early years, there's large areas that aren't townships. That's just because they aren't recognized as townships yet. That's why the whole map is not green, and it's not just like some of the other maps where all of Ontario was covered with different boundaries. Here, large portions aren't even covered.
So I want to make sure I understand the map at
Mhm.
slide 73. Let's just look at the snapshot from 1911 for a moment. Down in the area where the court record would show there was mining going on, I don't see any townships, and we know that there were some mines, not sorry, there were lands. I thought there were land, the record shows there were some land sold, but is it because is it only townships that you took into account, or in
For purposes
calculating?
of allocating the revenues, it's townships, because as we'll see on the next slide, that's how the data were available for acreage. I should also clarify, mining land sales or land sold for the purposes of mining are tracked separately and addressed in the mining accounts, and those are comprehensive.
Right,
This
so
is-
so you capture that even though they're not on the map.
That's correct. So see, here's a snapshot. This is the transcription we made of it.
When you say this is the
so slide
snapshot,
74
yes,
is a snapshot from 1917 of the acres, as it says, other than free grant. What does that mean? Well, through the late 19th and early 20th century, there were a lot of lands were granted free or given to settlers or veterans of the different wars without payment. So I don't include that revenue here because there was no revenue to include. So I'm looking at lands other than free grant lands. And you see we have acres that are sold and or acres that were patented. Acres that were patented can include lands that were granted free that were subsequently granted, but I look at acres sold. This is just to give an idea that see all these townships on the left-hand side. We know the number of acres sold, the district or county they're in, and we go through a similar exercise of what share of acres sold in Ontario were in these townships.
And just to sort of, I understand that as between you and some of the other experts, there's a difference on how to treat free grants. Is that fair? Or have I misunderstood?
For purposes of the net crown resource revenue exercise, there's no disagreement on how to treat the revenues because there are no revenues to include.
Yes.
When we get to the rents analysis, there is a difference of opinion on how to treat the free grant lands. I do estimate a value for those lands because they take the form of a tax expenditure, as Professor Stiglitz was discussing. And then there is a slight disagreement, as we'll get to in the expense section, about whether or not the expenses should be adjusted to reflect that not all of the lands that the Crown alienated, whether for money or for free, should be counted just against those that were sold. I make an adjustment to the expenses, as we'll get into in a little bit, recognizing that some of those expenses are to account for the fact that not all of those expenses were directed at supporting the revenues, because some of those expenses had to be about giving the lands away.
So that's in the straightforward NCRR approach.
That's correct.
Over
is
at
just a
slide
different-
75?
Right, so this is looking at the data in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Instead of townships, we have data on land and forest districts. This is similar data to what we looked at before for forestry, where we had those 5 columns and maybe the 20 or 30 districts. Just how the data is reported, they change it from time to time. Okay. So again, here's an example of land sales by district. We have numbers of acres, and we can go and allocate those. Just another snapshot.
And again, this is just illustrative of the process you use.
That's correct.
That's not the complete data set.
That's correct. Okay, so on the revenue side, we have in some years revenue by agricultural land, summer resort land, town sites, etc. In the public accounts, they break it out more detailed.
You're on slide 77
That's
now?
correct, on slide 77. And where those are broken out, we use district level data on the acres sold of those different types of land. So, in some years, it's all just crown land generally. Other years, they say, oh, here's how much we got from agriculture or summer resort or town sites. And those might have different average prices and they might have different distributions across the province. And we do the same exercise for all those different subtypes. So while there's only one way the Crown gets the money from selling or leasing the land, to the extent there are subdivisions reported, we just do the same exercise 4 or 5 times over.
Okay.
So this is summarizing what I said. We use the different acreage data. And then for the treaty territory, we use what we did above.
Sorry, you're looking at slide 78?
78, yeah. This is summarizing on the screen what I said in words.
Okay.
And there are some periods that we have to interpolate. And nothing super, less here than in other places, like 1948 is a good example. I just couldn't find a way to allocate it, but I have data for 47 forwards, 49 afterwards. So that's one of those like to simply connect the dot exercises. For the earlier period, 1901 to 1916, I take a multi-year average on both sides of the period.
And then we get to the comparison of the revenue on land sales
Mhm.
at slide 80.
That's correct.
And can you walk us through that, please?
Sure. So in general, there's not as much revenue from land sales and leases as from forestry or mining. I estimate Ontario-wide about 18 million, Professors Beaudoin and Smart 47 million. These are compared to the several hundred million or a couple of billion we talked about for the other revenues. There's a difference here, and part of that difference is Professors Beaudoin and Smart include additional lease revenue after 1966.
And you didn't.
I didn't feel I had a way to allocate it in an appropriate way. So to err on conservatism, I didn't include it. The impact on the RST is relatively small. Well, 52%, but $1 million.
Which I think brings us to net Crown resource revenues and how you treated and calculated hydroelectricity revenues. And that, I guess we start on slide 82.
Slide 82, yes. So hydroelectricity, this relates to collecting revenues from the waters. And I want to clarify, this is the only way that I measure Crown revenues from water. I don't include fish and game revenue, or I guess fish revenue. The game's not in the water, but the fish revenue. Mainly because of how it's reported in the data, and it's hard to get a clear way of allocating it about ponds and lakes in the district, because it's not just about, what portion of Lake Superior is in RST, but where is the fishing? And I didn't feel I had a reliable way to allocate that. So that's a source of direct Crown resource revenue that I don't allocate. So the main focus of water is on hydroelectricity.
So let me pause for a moment. Can you just perhaps let us know how the other experts treated fishing?
They also excluded fishing from their analysis. Fish and game and wildlife, the labels change over time. So the kind of one line item from hydroelectricity is hydroelectric operators pay a fee to the province of Ontario, often called the water rental fee. So to clarify, you're not actually paying based on how much water you use, you're paying based on how much hydroelectricity you generate. So despite a water rental fee, I don't have to measure the throughput of water or anything. It's all about kilowatt hours.
And so over on slide 83.
Yes, so for 83, I'm laying out basically how I did the approach. And hydroelectric facilities, a little bit like mines, they have the benefit that they don't move around. So once you know when one is online and where it's located, I know for all time if it's inside of RST or not. I don't have to worry about changing administrative boundaries and those sorts of things. So I identify the hydro generating stations, when they produced, and whether they're in RST or not. So as I say, I couldn't identify any single source from the government or public authorities that said how much water rental fee each station paid.
Each station being,
Each hydroelectric generating station.
okay,
So each facility. There's not that similar list like we had for mining profits tax, or we could say each mine, how much did they pay? There's nothing like that for hydroelectricity.
well, it does
There
look like
was-
it for a small period, 2001 to 2019, it is available.
So it's available because of this litigation. I got the data, I think, finally in mid-January 2022. I was provided a list of facilities that were, I think, anonymized on how much they paid in each of those years in the RST. So as I say, it's not available in any public source. We got it for purposes of this litigation for the most recent 20 years. I understand that's kind of when the data were kept. Similar to the mining profits tax, we got the most recent 15 years, give or take, and other things like that for forest management back to the late 90s. But besides that, there's no index of how much water rental fees directly were paid. So I have to allocate water rental fees using some information about these stations that are in RST. And I look at generation, which is the amount of power generated in a year. This is like the kilowatt hours or the megawatt hours. And then I also look at capacity where I don't have generation. The reason to look at generation is that the water rental fees are a function of generation. There's a price per kilowatt hour, if you will. In more recent years, it's price per revenue, but the revenue per kilowatt hour is fixed. So it's just a detail. And capacity is, the megawatts, how many it could produce. So where do we get the data? So Statistics Canada has this is now on slide 84, going through the data. There's a bunch of detail about station level capacity information. Geographic coordinates are provided starting in 1966. But of course, given they can't move, if that's where they were in 1966, that's where they were in 1965 and going back in time as well. Ontario produced this data. HEPCO, which used to exist and was the Hydroelectricity Power Company of Ontario, which is the public provider before the reorganization of Hydro in more recent years. Has annual reports that do tend to include generation by facility for certain years. So I use that where I can. And then Environment Canada provides coordinates of other monitoring stations where I couldn't find, the latitude and longitude of some of the other stations. So I take this together and, here's a map. So it kind of shows
Map
19
on on
page-
slide 85.
Yes, slide 85. This recreates figure 10 in my opening report. So the yellow line is the shape of RST that I'm looking at for illustrative purposes. And the different dots are hydroelectric generating stations. So I have snapshots here, 1930, 50, 70, and 90. And the size of the dot is how much power it produces. So you can see there's a few in 1930 in RST, and then more get added. And there's a lot of activity elsewhere in Ontario. And the big one down at the bottom is Niagara Falls, in case anyone's curious. Back power ratings. Okay. As I said, here's just where some of the data come from. We have a lot of capacity data, generating data for a smaller number of years. For those years where I'm missing generating data, I use capacity data. The two tend to be fairly highly correlated, but it's always possible that some are more efficient than others. So I look at data back to 1918. Before 1918, there was some hydroelectric activity in Ontario, but there's no easy way to split out what the water rental fees were. Remember, I mentioned in the early years with Crown leases, it was baked together, land leases and water leases. Before 1918, I don't have a way of separating them anymore. So I just assume none of that lease revenue was from hydro and instead deal with it in land sales.
That's an element of conservativeness on your part.
For hydro, I deal
For
with it in the
hydro.
land sales part of the analysis.
Yeah.
Okay. And so a lot of these data end in 1992. I then have to interpolate between 1992 and when we get this very rich data set from Ontario produced here that gives the very specific RST number. Okay. So here's just some snapshots. So what is this? We're looking at the Thunder-
On
slide.
slide 87, yes.
slide 87.
It's okay.
Looking at the Thunder Bay system, and you see here are 5 specific facilities. And so, we can go and look and see where are those facilities on a map. And here's the total output during this period of time. This is the kilowatt hours. So this is the generation of that facility in that time period. That's going to be directly correlated with water rental fees. So we go through this exercise for all the facilities and estimate, what share of generation was in the RST.
Are you looking at slide 88?
No, I'm still on 87. Oh, sorry. I'm just on 87. How much of that generation was in RST divided by the total generation of the province, multiply it by the water rental fees. Slide 88 is an example from Statistics Canada where, when I'm missing generation data, Statistics Canada tracks capacity. So here we have an example of a plant, High Falls in Michipicoten. It was placed in service in 1930, 2 generators, 1950, a 3rd generator. And so we have the capacity information on the right-hand side of when each, turbine or generator was placed into service and how much capacity it had. So together with the time and the amount, we can build a series over time of how much. So here we have this slide 89 is the kind of bottom line, if you will, how much of the provincial water rental fees I allocate to RST in each year. So the data on the right from 2001 onwards, those are from Ontario for purposes of this litigation. The solid line before is what I've calculated based on the methods I just described. Going through that exercise, here are the plans each year. I just showed 2 examples, but the same general approach holds. And then the dotted line in the middle is just averaging between those 2 periods where we're missing a bit of data.
Purely a question from
Sure.
curiosity. Is there any data that you can use that excludes Niagara? Like the proportion of water fees generated in the territory compared to the province
Yes.
excluding Niagara? Does that exist? It's just I'm just curious.
Sorry. Yes. In fact, the water rental fees that we allocate here exclude Niagara because for many years they're reported separately.
Oh.
Sorry. So the big one was dealt with separately. So we don't have to get into saying how much are we of what's left. There are some years where I think we probably included Niagara for purposes of the share, but not in the revenue. But in general, it's been excluded. Sorry.
So if we look at 89, this doesn't include Niagara.
If the answer yes means it
It
does
does
not.
not, that's correct. And this was something I should note, also a result of the collaborative process between the plaintiff's experts and Mr. Hamal, Ontario's expert.
So the chart here or the graph that you have, can you speak to the court as to the comfort level of the reliability and the confidence level you have in these figures? Or
Yeah.
in the graph and the figures that you got?
Sure. I think this is a very reliable exercise because we again have very detailed data. Hydroelectric facilities don't move. The government's kept pretty careful records, at least on capacity and in most years on generation. And we can use that to estimate the amount of water power generation in the treaty territories. That's that chart. There are some years where the data is not all there that you'd like to be there. I think it's very reliable, and the Crown's expert, Mr. Hamal, Ontario's expert, did agree. I mean, he reviewed the material and said, I think he pointed out some things he might have done differently, but concluded overall that the yearly water rental figures are reasonable estimates of the actual values. So I take some comfort in that there wasn't an alternative.
That, I think, takes us then to net Crown Resource revenues and how you dealt with Spectrum. And I guess that's starting at slide 92.
Yes.
And here I understand that the experts kind of disagree about whether Spectrum should be included. But right now, we're going to talk about your view on the matter.
Thank you. Yes, this is a revenue that I do include. Spectrum. What is Spectrum revenue? Well, it's revenue mainly from auctioning off blocks of spectrum. This is something that's done by the federal government. So the Department of was Industry Canada. I guess now it's Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. So this is a federal Crown revenue, but a direct one. And there is a disagreement here about whether or not spectrum revenues are relevant revenues. So there are a couple things to think about here. The first is that the government of Canada says spectrum is a natural resource, as a quote from their website.
When you say there's a quote from their website, you're referring to
Just on slide 92, the box in the middle here is a quote
Okay.
from Industry Canada. And as I addressed in my reports, spectrum is a resource and there is value there. Let me explain why. So the telecommunications companies want to reach their customers. To do so, they need unimpeded access to the blocks of spectrum. If they're all competing over the same band, it won't work out. Right? There'll be interference and it won't allow them to serve their customers. That's what has been referred to in some of these papers and some of the other material I said in my report is a congestion problem with spectrum. If we're all trying to use the same thing, nobody wins. And so you need some kind of
I'm
Sure.
going to admit something. which
Okay.
is, I don't really know what all the same things are. Is it a radio wave? What is it? When you say,
Oh,
if they're all trying to use the same
Got it.
thing, what is it? What's that thing?
it is to transmit through a given, I'll say, block of spectrum. So we're going to talk about some weird numbers later, but if you think about like the FM radio,
Yeah.
92.3 might be a radio station. If you use 92.3 and I use 92.7.
On our podcast.
Yeah, we're going to each have competing podcasts and everybody's going to tune into 92.3,
Yeah.
but they can turn their radios to 92.3 and just hear you. They can turn their radios to 92.7 and just hear me. But if we broadcast at the same frequency, it's going to be all garbled and not going to work out. So you want a dedicated block and I want a dedicated block so we can each serve our customers. So most of this is now for cell phones and everything else. The numbers are a lot higher, but I find it easier to think about, like the radio. Because we've had that, you drive from one district to another, maybe and it starts to get warbly, and then, you know, your music station has changed, and all of a sudden, you're like, why am I not listening to what I was listening to? Is that helpful?
Why am I getting country?
I'm
Okay.
a
But,
musical
but
taste.
I just, I want a little bit of, I don't know, the question may have been directed at some, maybe it's my, I'm gonna ask the question. When we talk about spectrum, we're talking about electromagnetic waves.
Yes,
And the amplitude or how does that work? The size of the wave matters and,
yes, so my example, that would be the frequency of the wave, 92.3 megahertz or 92.7 megahertz. But if we're both broadcasting at the same frequency, we get this interference problem. And nobody's going to listen to either of our stations.
so there's radio waves. But
Oh,
spectrum
sure.
isn't just radio waves, is it?
Radio just refers to how tight the waves are. At different blocks, we call them different things. It's all still spectrum. The
It's
radio's
all
like-
electromagnetic
so if you
waves.
flip to the next slide. There's an excerpt there from, I think, 2 slides, my bad. You see here, we have the
You're looking,
2300.
sorry,
I'm looking at slide 94, the table. at
we're
the
gonna
bottom.
come back to slide 92, but
Yes, I just want to
Okay.
give you an example here, like, see 2 gigahertz, sorry, the first row there, the table in the bottom right of slide 94, 24 and 38 gigahertz. So that would be the right to use those frequencies to push out content, broadcast. Now, it could be cell phones, you know, the example I gave was megahertz, which is a lot smaller, but it's basically the same thing, that if you can think of at what frequency you're pushing out the energy, the frequency measures this way, I think, on the scale.
when you say this way,
So along the x-axis, so high frequency, you shorten this. That's the, if you're all at the same frequency and you're, I don't have my cell phone, but if it's tuned in to listen at that frequency, it'll work. That's what I mean. So radio waves are just an example
so,
broadcasting a wave at a given.
okay, so explain to me how the use of this electromagnetic spectrum has anything to do with geography.
Oh, sure. We can go back a couple of slides. So
Yeah, go back to slide 92, yeah.
yeah, so we have to have 2 things. You have to have towers to broadcast. If we go back to our example, I don't know what's on 92.3 here in Sudbury, but I know from growing up, 92.3 was a station called Oz FM in Newfoundland. Up here, I wouldn't get it if I tuned into 92.3. I'd get whatever is here, right? If I drive further, whatever the local Sudbury station is on 92.3 is going to stop putting up towers or stop putting up repeaters. And eventually I'll hit, you know, whenever the next town has a station with 92.3, I'll start listening to that because they die out. There's an effective range over which you can broadcast. And for the higher and higher and higher frequencies, that effective range is shorter. So if we take like 5G on your cell phone, like the new cell phones, there's a smaller effective range than 4G, than 3G. It's the same reason why, really is an aside here, AM radio, you know, used to get much further range because it's at an even lower frequency. So the higher frequency, shorter range. So that's why it's kind of tied that, you know, you want, you know, again, in my 92.3 example, you want all the radio, you want to cover all of Sudbury with your podcast. You need to make sure you're on the towers at that range in Sudbury. But maybe you don't care if someone in Toronto hears your podcast. And so, you know, you don't care if I'm using 92.3 in Toronto or Oz is using 92.3 in Newfoundland. So that's why, you know, you want it in an area to be able to serve the customers. Is that helpful?
I think so. Can you comment on some of these studies that are mentioned?
Sure. So-
You refer to it, slide 92?
Yeah, these are some of the ones cited in my report and reply report. So because there exists this congestion problem in economics, you know, somebody wants to be on one band and somebody wants to be on the other. It's in both of our interests to do that. You know, you need a market, if you will, to make that happen. You know, it's in my interest to pay, you know, the court to make sure they're not using 92.7. And it's in the court's interest to pay me to make sure I'm not using 92.3. But we can have rights about that. And who should control those property rights. It's a natural resource, right? If we organize it in a given area, it's a little bit like saying who should be capturing the money from digging a mine or something like that. It's like, well, probably doesn't, the government should step in and collect something because it's a public natural resource. So that's why I think a lot of these papers are talking about spectrum as a natural resource. There could exist a market. I think in my report, I talk about Cosian rights, which is just, if there's this public good or congestion problem, there will be a solution where people will pay for the right to have access to that and know that only they have access to that. So, you know, you could go around and pay me a little bit of money and pay Mr. Schachter and everybody else with the podcast to not use the 92.3 band. Or we could all get together and say, we're just going to form a market together and we can all bid on the rights to certain bands. By bands, I mean bands of spectrum, because we value unimpeded access to that band. And the government has stepped in to run those auctions. And economists like them because they're auctions. So you tend to get something very close to the rent value, or the reservation price might be another way of putting it. To capture that you know, the telecom companies, Rogers, Bell, TELUS, they want that. They're, you know, because they want to be able to say to their customer, you come here, your cell phone will work.
When you say you come here, you mean a geographic area.
You need to come to Sudbury or Toronto, wherever. It will work. To make that promise, I need to have access to that block of spectrum in that area. Having access is necessary, and then I need to put up the towers for you to be able to do it. So if you know, maybe you're familiar, I know I am, when I used to go home, I had Rogers, there were no Rogers towers in the area. My cell phone wouldn't work from that for a long time, until eventually they got the towers there. So if you're not providing that, you need the access and then to build the towers. So I think the next slide, if you don't mind, is helpful to illustrate.
Slide 93.
This is slide 93. This is a picture of spectrum towers in Ontario as tracked by the government of Canada. That's the website at the bottom, gc.ca. There's a lot of towers there. So, you know, the value is not coming from, you know, the 1 acre plot of land where you put the tower. It's that throughout this whole area, you have that access to that unimpeded access to that block of spectrum. So you can, you know, tune all your devices to that block and get the benefit of that block and tell your customers, or not tell your customers, tune your customers' devices to that same block so you can communicate with them. And then they know they have service. So that's where the value is coming from, is, you know, your right to have all the 92.3 in Sudbury, so everyone can listen to your podcast.
Where do the waves come from? The towers?
Yeah, there's top of the towers. That's where the distance comes in. The higher frequency they broadcast at, the less effective their range.
Now, Professor Stiglitz talked a little bit about, tried to talk a little bit about what happens at the border. And I'm looking at the map here and there's no pinpoints in the United States.
Oh, we're just plotting the spectrum towers in Canada.
So
Yeah.
what happens? He talked about interference at the border, if memory serves me correct.
Right, you can have that. Interference at the border is very similar to if the court and I were broadcasting at the same frequency. But because maybe the auctions on each side of the border aren't coordinated, you can have a tower on each side of the land border broadcasting at the same frequency.
Now, if you're a cell phone provider, or you want to have the use of spectrum in the for Nipigon and Wawa and Thunder Bay, couldn't you just set up cell phone towers in outside of the treaty territory?
Probably could, but again, you can see the clustering here. If we think that telecom companies aren't putting up towers unless they have to, why build extra towers if you don't need them? You can see you need a fairly high density of towers because of the distance problem. And so just putting towers outside of RST, might get you a little bit of coverage on the border of RST, if you will, but it seems highly unlikely that anybody in Nipigon would get service.
Did you want to move on to slide 94?
Sure, 94. This is just the takeaway of ISED, the federal government department that runs these auctions and collects the revenue. They provided a paper, 2 years ago now, I suppose, where they had undertaken to say, here are the relevant options with people in the treaty territory. They walk through how the different blocks are constructed, estimated population, and allocated revenues based on those options.
So maybe you can just explain a little better for me. On slide 94, you've got at the bottom a 29, is that 29 million?
$29,107,000, that's correct.
And that's the portion of Spectrum revenues that Canada got that you attribute to the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory.
That's correct. Canada got a significantly higher amount than that, and they provided some detail on population mapping that they applied to their Spectrum revenues and generated this table. Reading the paper, it seemed reasonable, so I adopted their revenue estimates for RST.
So these are estimates from Canada. They might disagree whether it should be in or not, but it's their numbers. Is that
That's
what I'm to
correct,
take?
yeah. This is from, as I say, an ISED memo. We got a couple of updates to it, but this is provided by the government.
All right, so I think we are now at the calculation of net Crown resource revenues. And perhaps you can go over a general framework starting at slide 96.
Sure. So actually, before we get into this, do you mind if I provide a citation? The court had asked something about Niagara Power, and I remembered I had a footnote in my report, so I just wanted, if it's okay for me to mention to you, if you want to go back and read more about Niagara.
This is multitasking at its best. Okay.
Sorry. It's footnote 145 in my opening report, where I say that the water rentals associated with generating stations at Niagara appear to have been collected and reported separately. There's a couple of examples there, but just felt.
Thank you.
I was wondering, as we all learned so much about our reporting of. My apologies.
No, please.
No.
I knew I had some extra detail and I wanted to provide it before we change topics.
I'm sorry. I
Sorry,
missed it.
Just for the witness to keep his voice up a little bit.
okay.
Oh, my-
So, Mr. Hutchings, we're at paragraph 96. Sorry, slide 96, general framework. I'm
Okay.
keeping my voice up to encourage him to keep his voice up.
I feel like I'm shouting, but I guess I'm not. So I'll keep it.
It's always,
Keep it up.
it's usually the end of a sentence where you drop.
Okay. Try to push through. Okay, so let's talk about the expenses. We've talked about the revenues. That's the gross part, if you will, gross revenues before expenses. And now I'm going to talk about the framework I use to estimate the relevant expenses that I then subtract off to get NCRRs. So this is just repeating, I think, what I said first thing this morning, that I look at the guidance from the court and I look at expenses as those expenses related to collecting, regulating, and supporting those revenues, where those revenues are the revenues we've just spent the last couple hours talking about.
Oh, okay, now you've italicized those revenues. There's something important about those revenues. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. An expense might support many things, or it might regulate many things. And I need to focus on those expenses that collect, regulate, and support those revenues rather than, say, other indirect revenues like income taxes or other social objectives of the Crown.
Now, could one look at expenses related to collecting, regulating, and supporting rents? That's a different analysis.
Yes, that's correct. That would be a different analysis. One could do it, and I talk later on, or I will talk later on about how you have to adjust this analysis when we come to estimating rents to include additional expenses that support rents, but not direct Crown resource revenues.
So in your analysis, just to be clear, you're looking at expenses that support relevant revenues that are included.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay.
So we get to slide 97.
Sure. So before we dig into it, we can think about a basket of total Crown resource-based expenses. So expenses the Crown makes related to resources. Now, within those, some are going to be relevant for the collection, support, and regulation of revenues. And if they're relevant, that's the blue box, I need to include all of them. Some of them are going to be unrelated to revenues. And if they're not relevant, they're excluded from my analysis. And then some, and a growing number, will be in this teal colored box of what I call partially relevant, and I partially include them. This is the kind of indirect overhead discussion that I had earlier this morning.
And when you use the term resource-based expenses,
Uh-huh.
is your starting point what the Crown's considered expenses, or was that an independent identification on your part? Here are all the possible expenses that are, your words, resource-based, and I will make my own identification of relevant, not relevant, or partially relevant. Or was your starting point what the Crown said were resource-based expenses? Although you may have
Yeah,
done your,
I
you
haven't-
may have done your report first, so I'm not
Yes.
sure.
I haven't thought about it in quite those terms before.
Okay.
But I would say I started with, I think this is consistent with where the Crown's experts started, even though we take different approaches. The expenses the Crown incurred in what are sometimes called the resource-based ministries. So, for example, I start with, what did the Department of Lands and Forests spend, and then go through this three-way exercise. I don't look at the Department of Health, for example, and neither
Got
do
it.
the Crowns.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
I think perhaps my understanding is that you and the experts shared a common data set, correct?
That's correct. We exchanged data on expenses as well as revenues. Again, directed at this, I'll say, transcription issue that we wanted to at least be in agreement of what was the dollar recorded when. So we were just then discussing, I think I called them issues of principle or methodology this morning.
And as we go through this trial, we're going to have a situation, I think, where the Bodway and Smart know what you included or excluded. They may disagree with it. And you know what they included or excluded, and you may disagree with that. But it's not like we're working from two unknowns. I don't know if that's a fair way
Yes,
to
I
put
think
it.
that's correct. Like, we want to take an example of $1,000 was spent on land agent salaries in 1875. For the record, I don't know that that's the number. I'm making this up. I don't think we have any disagreement about whether or not $1,000 was spent. We have a disagreement that I'll talk about in a little bit about whether that is fully relevant or only partially relevant. But we're both working off the same $1,000.
Right. So at the end of the day, it's our hope that you will have the tools and the information to make the decision with confidence of at least knowing what was spent. And then you'll have to decide if it's in or out. And same with revenues, what was received in or out.
Thank you.
So I think there are four important considerations. I'm on slide 98 now.
Mhm.
That go into this general framework. The first is one we've had a little bit of a discussion about, that expenses are related to relevant resource revenues, not resource rents or resources more generally. For this analysis, I'll come back to a different expense analysis when I estimate rents.
Okay, so this analysis being the analysis of net Crown resource revenues.
That's correct. Next thing I want to talk a little bit about is what I call an economic view of Crown decision-making, how to view expenses the Crown might make through the lens of economics, and explaining why certain things might look different if you only consider a subset of benefits versus all the benefits. Then I want to talk a bit more at depth about cost allocation. So this is my transfer pricing example from earlier, something near and dear to me. And then finally, I'll talk about how I read the Crown's obligation to consult when it comes to the identification of net Crown resource revenues. So let's start with the first one.
Over on slide
slide
99.
99. But slide 100, I think, is a more
Okay. slide
helpful
100.
illustration of the three-step method I discussed first thing this morning. First is to identify the relevant resources. So this would be the mining, the forestry, the hydro, the land, the spectrum. I've not included fishing, for example. And step 2 is to identify relevant Crown revenues from those resources. So again, I'm only looking at the direct Crown revenues from those resources. I'm not considering indirect revenues like taxes and income taxes or HST, despite that being a big chunk of the pie today for Ontario as a whole. And then the third step, and so I've, let me say the conclusion of step 2 is that listing of revenue items I had at the start of each of the resources. I said, here are the 8 revenues I consider, or the 6 revenues, or the 2 revenues. And then step 3 is, given those revenues, what are the relevant expenses related to collecting, supporting, and regulating?
So the difference in the NCRR approach and the economic rents approach is the relevant Crown revenues.
That's correct.
And the difference between the Crowns and the plaintiffs on arriving at gross is largely focused on relevant expenses. So relevant
right.
becomes the word of difference.
Yes.
But when it comes to gross, there's really not much of a difference.
What is there?
Gross on
expenses.
NCRRs.
Well, that NCRRs is net Crown resource
Oh,
revenues,
sorry.
but gross revenues
In step 1.
in step 1. Mr. Hutchins took us through
Yes.
some slides that said there's not much of a difference there. And
No, my question was the difference between the NCRR approach and the economic rents approach
right.
was how one interprets relevant.
For purposes of the expenses, yes, it's how one interprets relevant. Actually, for
Okay.
both, I guess, for both.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I can.
But I mean, we're going to get to this, but as I understand it, the amount of well, the witness has already testified the amounts of the amounts of expenses to offset rents, because rents capture more than just direct,
Are different
and they're greater, right?
and they're greater.
Yeah.
I think I have it. Yeah.
So when I'm on slide 101 now, when it comes to assessing the relevance of a given expense, I always kind of return to the question of how does this expense relate to the revenues included in my NCRR calculation? Now, when we come to rents, I'll replace the word NCRR with rents, but for this calculation, how does the expense I'm looking at, considering its relevance, how does it relate to the revenues? If I look at expenses without regards to which revenues are being included, I'm going to lead to an imbalance. So if I included, for example, all the expenses related to rents in my NCRR calculation, that'd be an imbalance because I only looked at some revenues and I'm looking at more expenses. And then I use the same expenses in both sets of calculations. Logically, that has to be wrong because I'm looking at a bigger basket of benefits on the other side. And that's a question of principle, I guess. And then I look at kind of practical considerations and context. So there are some geographic specific things. So if data in the public accounts say a given expense is took place in a given township, for example, that's inside RST, well, I don't need to worry about attributing it or allocating it. I know where it happened. Similarly, if something happened outside of RST, I don't need to worry about how to allocate it because I know where that happened. I gave the revenue example earlier of the Mississauga salvage project. If that's not in our region, it's not relevant. And there are some areas where professors Bodwing and Smart do the same. I give an example here, mining development in Rat Portage, which is outside of the RST. Neither one of us include those expenses.
But were there other areas where the two of you disagree on this issue of geographical specific expenses?
Yes, so one example I think is reforestation. So during the period of time where reforestation is a separate line item in the public accounts, we can look at other data to tell us that that activity wasn't happening in RST, it was happening elsewhere in the province. So if you know all the expenses happening in Southern Ontario, I might be intellectually curious about how to allocate that among Southern Ontario, but it doesn't affect how I allocate it to RST. Right? If there was none of that happening here, I don't need to allocate it to RST. Does that make sense?
I think maybe it's slide 102.
Yes.
This might help.
So 102, this is a report. I reference it in my reply report. It's a picture from the 1943 annual report of the Department of Lands and Forests that shows reforestation zones. And you see there in Southern Ontario. There's also a quote, a text quote on the bottom left corner from the same annual report of the Department of Lands and Forests that says how the Division of Reforestation is concerned with the promotion of forestry among private owners and public agencies in Southern Ontario. There's some other academic commentary that says the same up until, it was not until after the Second World War that reforestation efforts moved north. So from this period, 1913 to 1947, simply wasn't happening in the RST. So we don't have a question about allocating it.
So just this map of Ontario showing reforestation zones, that's not just a map of a subset of the reforestation zones, that's all of the reforestation zones.
That's right.
And so,
But it's not in the RST. Yeah. So that's kind of one example of how, given the revenues we include, what are the expenses? Now, the next principle I want to talk about is this kind of economic view of Crown decision making. So what does that mean? Well,
we're at slide 104 now.
we're at slide 104. It kind of seems, when we think about why does the Crown or any government spend money, it probably has many objectives, right? And those objectives go beyond collecting, regulating, and supporting direct Crown resource revenues. Right? The costs further a bunch of objectives. And this is, I think, a non-controversial point. Professor Mintz and Mr. O'Riordan agree. They say in their report, a public owner like the Crown may be willing to accept a loss in net resource revenues if other objectives are satisfied, including more prosperity for the population and tax revenues. So what does the tax revenues mean? That's some of the indirect revenues I spoke about earlier. More prosperity, that can include a whole host of social or political objectives. Professor Stiglitz was talking about maybe increased employment, increased well-being. Economists might say increased gross domestic product. That's the fancy economic term for total output of the economy.
So increased domestic, sorry, what was it?
Gross domestic product.
Increasing gross domestic product is over and above just tax revenues.
That's right. So I'm just using that as some example of more prosperity for the population. But,
Right.
What does that mean economically? We like equations. So I put on the bottom of the slide an equation I took from my reply report.
Some of we.
Oh, some of we, well, speaking for myself, I like equations, but I'll try not to put too many numbers and focus on the words.
Sorry.
No worries. So what does that mean is if the Crown is kind of acting rationally and considering its costs, it's going to look at when making a certain expense, is my benefit higher than my expense? We all go through this decision all the time, even if we don't formalize it in this way of, is this product worth more to me than the price? If so, I'll buy it. Companies go through this, should they invest in a project? But when the Crown is looking at spending money, it would naturally look at all the things that I've discussed and that Professor Mintz and Mr. Reardon acknowledge: the increase in direct Crown resource revenues and the increase in other Crown revenues, because the Crown gets a piece of that, and the increase in other benefits. So any given cost could be supporting one or more of those things. And we just need to keep that in mind when we then come to identifying costs, when we're only looking at the top benefit, right? The revenues we've included are only that increase in direct Crown resource revenues. So it's just something we keep having to come back to, that a given cost might have many other objectives. And if so, how or can we or should we allocate it amongst those other objectives? Kind of to put that equation into a little bit of words, at slide 105.
Slide 105, yes.
If we're going to include all of the costs on the right-hand side, it would make sense to include all of the benefits on the left-hand side. But because we're not including all of the benefits on the left-hand side, it would be wrong to include all of the costs. And so I say, to be kind of economically meaningful, to look at the substance of the activity, we have to look at expenses that are related to the benefits we're tracking. Otherwise, we'll end up with an imbalance. And a peculiar thing would be, we'd say there are then no costs relevant to those other items. And so they would appear artificially high. Sorry.
Could you finish this statement for me, please? On slide 105, the first bullet point.
Mhm.
To include all of the costs, one must include all of the benefits to achieve what? Or to get a picture of,
I would say to calculate net benefits. And those could be net Crown resource revenues, they could be net rents, they could be net anything. But if we're doing this offsetting of benefits and costs,
so we focus on net.
Right.
And you say, so in my house, money comes in, money goes out. At the end, I have a net balance of
Yes.
my account, or let's say it's my bank account.
Sure.
So I only am using dollars. I'm not measuring my happiness, what I have spent it on. I'm not measuring my fitness level, or I'm not measuring how pretty my house is. I'm only measuring on that page those two things that are the same kind of measurement. Money.
yes.
Okay.
I mean, economists have ways of kind of putting value on some of those other things.
Yes.
So let's take painting a room in your house. There may be no extra money that comes into that, but that might be in that third bucket of other benefits. You're like, oh yes, but I'm balancing that out. So if I were to just look at the ledger, it might show up as, negative $100 because you went to Canadian Tire and got the paint and the roller. But the benefit, economists would say, has to be worth at least $100 to you because you like the paint. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gone and done it. So even though it might show up as a negative number, economists would say rationally, if we had a way of putting money on that benefit, it has to be higher than the cost or you wouldn't have done it.
But it's not just the beauty of the paint. It could also increase the value of the house when you sell it.
That's also true. Right. If your realtor told you, if you fixed up that leaky bathroom, you'd get more money, you might go and do that for that reason. It could be both. That's right.
But the point is you have to capture the benefit as well as the expense if you want to do a matching, is what you're saying.
That's right. I'm just using the example of the bank account, like, you buy lunch or something, you don't then have a tally of the benefit of that lunch, but you benefited by at least that amount of money. So it's not a loss, even though it looks like a loss.
I think in your slides, you get into three factories that helps better explain
Yes.
this.
I'll get into that. Okay, we can go on to slide 106. So another part that's related to this is what I call the reasonable expectation of a net positive result. That's a lot of jargon to just say, if we're going to look at an incremental expense, and economists do everything kind of at the margin, the incremental thing. Should we include the expense? We need to think, where is the revenue that it's going to support? And is it possible at least? And at least reasonably likely, it'll be positive. So how does that factor into all of this? The way I apply it practically is where there's a cost undertaken that cannot or will not generate a benefit. We come back to the giving away of land, will not capture a benefit as I measure it. Sorry, that's important. Because we're only measuring the direct Crown resource revenues. It would be, in my opinion, wrong to include the costs because the benefit is zero. The cost will surely be positive, which means the net has to be negative. It can never be positive. Contrast that with, I do include survey expenses, and you might incur the survey expense before you sell the land. That would be okay because rationally you can say I'm going to spend $100 today to survey the land, and then tomorrow I'm going to sell it for $200. You expect to get to a positive result. It's possible. Land values could crater, but it's possible. Whereas in the former category, it's not possible. So it's a small thing, and I think it has an interesting implication. As I say, I'm on slide 107 now. This is the equation reduced down. We're only looking at that top line item when we calculate the benefits, right? The direct Crown resource revenues. And that's why, we know that's only part of the reason why the costs happen. If we were to allocate all the costs to direct Crown resource revenues, we have this mismatch. So we can go ahead one more slide. Oh, I come back to it in a minute. Okay, if we were to allocate it all, we have a mismatch. And that's why it's important to keep in mind this relationship about the relation, the costs that support those revenues. Those revenues isn't everything on the left, right? It's just the top little piece. Okay, so with that, let me talk about an example of cost allocation. So 109.
Okay, thanks. We'll just take a minute.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, so Mr. Hutchins, you were going to tell us about cost allocation.
Yeah, so we can go to slide 109. I'm going to talk about how to make this a little more practical. Okay, there we go. So, a point I've made before of an expense item can serve multiple purposes. That's the equation I put up before. And here I'm talking a little more generally. I'm not talking about just the Crown. That example was focused on Crown decision making. But you can think about a business, you can think about, a multinational. And, it could be for many reasons. It could be because of its nature. So, if you lease an office building, that supports all activities within the office building. If I then wanted to go and examine the profits of one division of that company, it'd be wrong to include all of that lease revenue. And it'd be wrong to include none of the lease revenue, right? Because some of that is benefiting those people on that floor. It could also be because.
So when you say revenue or expense? The leasing revenue, you said it would be wrong to include the leasing revenue.
Oh, sorry.
Are
It
we
would-
talking about a company that's in the business of leasing stuff out?
No, sorry, I
I
meant
thought it was the leasing expense.
leasing expense, sorry. Yeah. So if I wanted to look at the profits of one division of that company on one floor, I would take their revenues and subtract off a portion of the lease expense. It would be wrong to subtract off all the lease expense, and it'd be wrong to subtract off none of the lease expense. Could also be because of the nature of the level of aggregation in reporting. So you might have, for example, in my multinational, you have a head office somewhere that just has, salaries of back office support. Well, we don't quite know how to disentangle that, but some of that is going to be relevant to each of the divisions. right? You need the accountant, you need the HR function. They're all blended together. So again, you take the extremes. No one division should pay for all of that. But each division needs to pay for some of that, right? If you included none, that would also be wrong. So, cost allocation methods are used to assign costs and profits. I talked about it in the tax transfer pricing context earlier, but it's relevant for also say, a company wanted to sell one of its divisions. It would probably go through an exercise of allocating these expenses because a potential buyer would want to know what's the full cost of running this, right? These indirect costs. If you were to just look at the revenues, they might be understated. The profitability might be overstated. So, the procedure for dealing with this at a general level is pretty straightforward. You first want to identify those costs that need to be allocated. So those costs that are partially relevant, but maybe fulfill many purposes, and select a basis for allocation. Maybe it's based on the revenue of each division, maybe it's based on headcount. There's a whole field of cost accounting about this. And then you allocate it. So when you look at the profitability or the net result for any individual bucket, you have a meaningful net result, right? It includes some of those overhead costs. So the next, okay, so this is slide 110. So returning to this equation I had before, that basket of kind of costs that support many functions can only be allocated once. Right, makes sense. I mean, you don't, if the head office costs are $50, you don't deduct $50 off each division. That would be a multiple counting. So if, and this is slide 111 now, if we put all of the costs on only one of the benefits, say we allocate all those costs to direct ground resource revenues, a necessary implication of that is that those costs shouldn't be counted against the other benefits, the indirect tax revenues, the general prosperity of society. So if you say a given cost supports only one benefit, that implies it does not support those other benefits. But we've started by saying, but hang on, it actually supports all of those things. So that's why you need allocation. So here's a very simple example. Say we have a head office with $50 of common costs, salaries, back office, whatever. And it has 3 factories. Looked at in standalone, the 3 factories make different amounts of money. $10, $90, $50. Say you wanted to sell one of those factories. You'd need an estimate of the profits of those factories. So I think the next slide kind of tees this up. We know in total, there's $100 of profit throughout the whole bucket.
So
The
slide
113,
113.
113. Because there's 10 plus 90 plus 50, that's $150 in profits at the factory level and $50 in head office costs. So in total, there's $100, but how much of that is attributable to each factory? And say you did a study and came up with the percentages I'm showing on 114, where maybe 20% go to one factory, 50% go to another factory, 30% go to the third factory. You could then attribute that $50 in those proportions. Because again, it would be wrong to deduct $50 off each of them. Each individual factory doesn't need all of the head office people. So if we do this allocation, we come up with say $10, $25, $15.
You're looking at slide 115.
That's slide 115. And then 116 shows the effect of that $10 gross profit has been reduced to 0. Factory 2 was making 90, now it's making 65. Factory 3 was making 50, now it's making 35. This is kind of the fully allocated, taking into account those indirect costs, right? Costs that didn't occur at the factory, but occurred because of the factory at the head office. This is fairly straightforward. This is, I will admit, a highly stylized example with 3 factories and 1 head office. In real life, you might imagine, a head office in each country, an international head office, more complications. But the principle is the same, right? That you have to somehow account for everything. So what does that mean here? Well, here's an example on slide 117, of a picture that Professor Stiglitz showed last week.
And I think here we're getting into the practicalities of what happens on allocation. So explain this again.
Sure. So this is the one we looked at last week. This is a measure of GDP, or gross domestic product. Just how most economists think of the total output of the economy. It's the thing that's reported every quarter on the news about how GDP did. And summing up the 4 categories that Ontario uses in a report, and I'm going to talk about this in detail in a bit, related to the forest, which is paper manufacturing, wood product manufacturing, support activities for forestry. What does that mean? Like specialized machinists, that sort of thing for forestry, and then the forestry and logging itself. So Ontario says these 4 sectors are, the GDP of our forest economy, if you will. And then what I've included at the bottom, the dashed orange line right at the bottom, is Professors Bodway and Smart's included forestry revenues. I should say, in general, we don't disagree that much on the revenue side. We disagree on the expense side, as a foreshadowing. We see that's a very small amount relative to the GDP. And their expenses, which are the dashed red line, are a small amount relative to the GDP, but a large amount relative to the included revenues. Now, there are 2 hypotheses that Professor Stiglitz talked about last week and that I also pose in my reply report. One is that the forests are in this net negative position for.
Sorry, can I
Yeah.
just see if I can distinguish these colored lines?
Sure.
You say which one's the bottom line?
Orange is the bottom, the included
Revenues.
You can
Yeah.
see it the best easily at the intersection of 1997 and 0. Just above the 0, there's the orange line starts, and then the scale of the chart makes it that
I
the
think I see.
orange line is down at the bottom.
Yeah,
So
on
the
right-hand
top
side-
dotted line is revenues, the bottom dotted line is expenses.
No.
Sorry.
Opposite.
It's the opposite, yeah. So the way it's labeled on the right axis is reversed of how it shows up in the chart. So the red line is expenses is always higher than the orange line, which is revenues.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes,
So for the period here, it's showing a net loss in every single year.
That's correct.
Okay.
I think I was talking about the 2 hypotheses. One is that there is in fact this persistent loss in forestry. Or the other is that these expenses support more than just those included revenues.
The direct revenues.
Exactly, the included revenues, which are the direct Crown resource revenues. Now, Professor Stiglitz talked about different measures of developed countries. How much of GDP do they capture in tax revenue? I forget the range he gave, but in my reply report, I looked specifically at Canada. So this is data from the OECD. That's that organization of economic for all the developed countries. OECD data specific to Canada, that number is 33%.
And now you're looking at
I
slide
think, I
118.
have a question.
what is 33%?
If we go back. So the estimate from the OECD of how much of GDP is captured in tax revenues,
Okay, right.
or any kind of revenue, doesn't have to be tax revenue, but captured in government revenue by government
Yes,
in Canada specifically is 33%. Developed countries generally, I think 25 to 35%. So this isn't enough to say, the precise exercise I talked about earlier that was impractical of for any given corporation or for any given person, how much of their income tax is attributable. But given this broad measure of GDP, we can say, okay, if it was 33%, which is the average for Canada during this period, what would that look like as a kind of measure of total direct and indirect Crown revenues?
And benefits,
No,
not benefits.
just revenues. I don't
Just
have a measure of benefits here. So on the next slide, 118, You notice
So-
the green line is now a lot lower. But that is effectively just 33% of the total from the prior slide. Talk about this in my reply. This is, using that OECD estimate, on average, how much of that GDP related to forestry would Canada, Ontario, et cetera, have captured through its usual government taxing powers, if you will. And that answer is the green line at the top.
So up to the green line in the top is the revenues that the Crown actually gets.
It is an estimate of what the Crown actually gets. I haven't
Okay.
gone through the income tax data. As I said at the top, it's a difficult apportionment exercise, but for this exercise, I think it shows, there's a substantial amount of benefit that's well above that orange line at the bottom. So in our factory analogy, if we think about direct revenues as one of our factories and indirect revenues as the other factory, and that red line of expenses supports both, there needs to be some allocation, and these factories look a little lopsided. I'm going to return to that in a specific calculation later on, but what I'm saying there is the second hypothesis is that that red line supports the green line, in which case benefits exceed costs, and spending all that money on forestry made a lot of good sense economically when you measure the total benefits against the costs,
When the total
Crown benefits,
the Crown revenues or the Crown benefits.
a measure of Crown direct and indirect revenues against the costs.
That we would see on slide 117 against that total.
No, sorry, if we measure, go ahead, to slide 1.
Well,
Yep.
you said the red line supports the green line
Yes, on slide 118,
on slide 118.
yes.
And would that green line come from or look like the top of the graph on 117?
It's 33% of the top of that graph. So it looks like
Same
it's
shape.
just scaled down, exactly same shape, just smaller,
Okay,
to recognize that 2/3 of the GDP goes to corporations and people.
oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks.
So, Mr. Hutchins, just so the red line on slide 118 is Bodway and Smart's expenses that they include. And you're saying that those expenses, and you have your own calculation, which is different, but
Yes.
whatever the expenses they include support not just the direct revenues, which is the orange line, correct?
That's correct.
It also supports all the other Crown revenues estimated on the green line.
That's correct.
And your calculation of expenses is tied to the direct expenses.
In this period, my calculation of expenses is tied to the direct revenues.
Direct revenues, I'm sorry, I misspoke. We're close to 12:45. We only have a very small section to deal with on the last part of the framework. Maybe we should just go through that. It should be about 4 or 5 minutes.
And we have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay,
So with that, the last principle I think to keep in mind when it comes to identification of expenses for the NCRR calculation, which are those expenses that collect, regulate, and support the relevant revenues. I find it helpful to keep in mind this obligation that I found in the amended judgment. The Crown is required to periodically engage in a process in consultation with the First Nation treaty parties to determine the amount of net Crown resource-based revenues. I think, particularly in light of the context I gave earlier about the declining importance of direct Crown resource-based revenues, lack of granularity in the accounts, I think this provides a helpful framing device for the exercise I'm going through now of how do I attribute costs to the expenses, that there has to be that symmetry, and that an obligation to consult to me on the amount of quantity, here that's the amount of NCRRs, kind of takes as a precursor the identification of the NCIRs. The amount might just be a summing up exercise that an accountant can do. The identification, I think, is important. And I just take that as, again, in the background of how to think about, given the narrow definition of revenues, how to identify expenses. And I think that concludes the framework section.
Yeah, so I think now would be a perfect time to break unless the court has some questions about what we've gone through.
No, thank you. I'm just catching up.
So if we're at 12:45, would the court like to return at 2 or 2:15?
What did you propose? I
I
think it
said
was
2
an
or
hour and a half,
2:15.
right?
An hour and a half would take us to 2:15.
Ms. Martin, no? That worked for you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. That's what we're gonna do. 2:15 then. Just let me one catch up. Revenues, and you went on. I don't know that you finished that sentence. You say the identification of expenses is important. And is that given the narrow definition of revenue?
Given the narrow definition of revenue, one needs a complementary narrow definition of expenses.
Okay,
And I wonder, were you asking questions, Justice, about his comments about the consultation part? Because that's what he spoke to last. I was-
he spoke to that last, but I got it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I know this is dense and I am, want to be as deferential as I can to our reporter who we will all be relying on. So, and as it was explained to me, you get to create all these cheaters, move quickly through this material. If you get any of that. All right, we'll have lunch break. Thank you.
This court stands adjourned until 2:15. Thank you.